Story 1. The Logger's Find. Marcus Webb had been working timber contracts in the mountains of North Carolina for 19 years when he discovered the trees that grew wrong. He operated his own small logging company, employing 3 other men in working sections of national forest where selective harvesting was permitted under federal guidelines. Marcus knew trees, could identify species by bark texture and darkness, could estimate bored feet by eye, understood growth patterns and wood quality better than most forestry graduates. The contract for Section J447 came through in March 2021, authorizing removal of diseased hemlocks in a remote valley near the Tennessee border. Hemlock woolly adelgid had devastated the species throughout Appalachia, and the Forest Service paid contractors to remove dead and dying trees before they became fire hazards. Standard work that Marcus had performed dozens of times. His crew accessed the site via an old logging road that hadn't been maintained in decades, their trucks bouncing over ruts and fallen branches for 3 miles before reaching the designated section. The valley was narrow and steep-sided, the kind of isolated hollow where sunlight only penetrated a few hours each day. Marcus noticed immediately that the hemlocks here looked different. Not diseased, but malformed, their trunks twisted in ways that suggested damage during early growth, branches emerging at wrong angles. "These trees are fucked up," observed Danny Reese, one of Marcus's crew members, a man with 12 years of logging experience. "Look at how they spiral. Never seen hemlocks grow like that naturally." Marcus agreed, but didn't see how it affected their job. Twisted wood was harder to mill, but the contract paid by volume removed, not quality delivered. They set up equipment and began the process of felling, delimbing, and sectioning the marked trees. Marcus operated the chainsaw personally on the first hemlock, a tree approximately 80 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter. The chainsaw bit into the trunk and immediately hit resistance. Not hardness, the wood wasn't particularly dense, but resistance. As if the tree was pulling away from the blade fiber by fiber, creating drag that made cutting unexpectedly difficult. Marcus adjusted his angle and continued, completing the notch cut and beginning the back cut that would drop the tree. When the hemlock fell, it screamed. Not the crack and groan of wood fiber separating. Marcus knew those sounds intimately. This was a scream, high-pitched and agonized, lasting the 3 seconds it took the tree to hit the ground. Every man in the crew heard it. They stood frozen, chainsaws idling, staring at the fallen hemlock. "Wind through the branches," Marcus said finally, though he didn't believe it. "Weird acoustic thing. Let's keep working." But when they sectioned the trunk into logs, Marcus saw something that made his stomach clench. Inside the growth rings visible in the exposed wood of each cut were shapes. Not knots or burls, but deliberate shapes. Faces, bodies, human forms rendered in the darker heartwood against lighter sapwood. The figures were crude but unmistakable. People with mouths open, arms raised, bodies contorted. "What the hell is that?" Danny asked, pointing at a cross-section showing what looked like a woman's face, expression twisted in agony, perfectly formed in the wood grain. Marcus had no explanation. Tree rings occasionally formed patterns that resembled faces, pareidolia, the human tendency to see familiar shapes in random data. But these weren't random. They were consistent across multiple sections, showing the same figures at different stages, as if the tree had been recording them year by year as it grew. They felled 3 more hemlocks that afternoon, and each screamed when it fell. Each trunk revealed similar images in its growth rings, human figures trapped in wood, their forms documented in annual rings spanning decades. Marcus documented everything with photos, planning to report the anomaly to the Forest Service. That night, camped near the worksite, Marcus dreamed of being inside a tree. He felt bark forming over his skin, felt roots extending from his feet into soil, felt his arms stretching upward and subdividing into branches. He was aware but immobile, watching years pass in accelerated time, feeling growth rings forming around him layer by layer, encasing him deeper in wood. When he woke at 3 a.m., Marcus found bark-like calluses on his palms that hadn't been there before. The crew resumed work the next morning, and Marcus tried to ignore his unease. They felled 6 more hemlocks, each one screaming, each revealing trapped figures in its cross-sections. By mid-afternoon, Danny refused to continue. "This is wrong, Marcus. Those are people in the wood. Actual people somehow trapped inside these trees. I don't know how it's possible, but I'm not cutting down any more of them." Marcus wanted to argue, but found he agreed. The figures in the wood were too detailed, too consistent, too obviously intentional. Someone, or something, had trapped people inside growing trees, and those people had been alive during the process, their forms recorded in annual growth rings as the wood accumulated around them. Marcus contacted the Forest Service and reported unusual findings requiring expert assessment. A forestry officer named Patricia Donovan arrived 2 days later, accompanied by a botanist from NC State University. Marcus showed them the felled trees, the faces in the cross-sections, explaining the screaming sounds during falling. Patricia examined the wood carefully, taking samples for laboratory analysis. "This is remarkable," she said, her tone clinical. "The darker wood forming these shapes appears to be a different cellular structure than surrounding tissue, denser with unusual lignin composition. It's almost like scar tissue, as if the tree grew around foreign objects and incorporated them." "Foreign objects shaped like people?" Marcus asked. The botanist, Dr. Raymond Chen, measured growth rings and made calculations in a field notebook. Based on ring count, these figures began forming approximately 40 to 60 years ago, with new rings continuing to add layers annually. If these shapes represent actual insertion into the living trees, that process would have occurred in the 1960s and continued as the trees matured. Marcus led them deeper into the section, to an area his crew hadn't yet reached. Here, the twisted hemlocks grew in greater density, their malformed trunks creating a grove that felt profoundly wrong. The trees here had grown into each other, trunks fusing, branches interweaving, creating a lattice of living wood that looked almost architectural. And in the center of the grove, Marcus found the source. A clearing containing remnants of a structure, a cabin or small building long since collapsed, its rotted timbers overgrown with moss and ferns. Scattered around the ruins were tools, axes, saws, logging equipment from decades past, and something else: bones. Human bones scattered among the ruins, dozens of skulls and long bones and rib cages, some partially buried, others fully exposed. Patricia called for law enforcement immediately, recognizing a potential crime scene. While they waited for police to arrive from the nearest town 40 miles away, Marcus explored the ruins more carefully. He found a journal protected in a rusted metal box beneath fallen timbers. The pages were brittle and water-damaged, but partially legible. Marcus read entries dated from 1967 to 1969, written by someone named Caleb Morrison, who identified himself as a forest guardian and protector of the old ways. Caleb's entries described a ritual he'd learned from the old woman on the ridge, a process for making people part of the forest permanently. The ritual involved binding living subjects to young trees, using techniques Caleb described in disturbing detail. Ligatures at specific points on the body, incisions to allow tree roots to accept the offering, chemical preparations applied to both flesh and bark to encourage merging. According to the journal, Caleb had performed this ritual on 43 people over a 3-year period. His victims were wanderers and trespassers, those who showed no respect for the forest, who needed to be taught their place in the natural order. He described watching the trees slowly consume his victims over weeks, roots penetrating bodies, bark forming over skin, the subjects remaining conscious during the early stages of the transformation. The final entry, dated November 1969, suggested Caleb had become concerned about discovery. He wrote about hiding evidence, about ensuring the trees keep their secrets. The entry ended mid-sentence, as if Caleb had been interrupted or abandoned the journal suddenly. Police arrived and secured the scene. Over the next week, forensic teams excavated the site, recovering remains of 37 individuals from around the clearing. Ages ranged from late teens to 60s based on skeletal analysis, and forensic anthropologists confirmed the remains dated to the 1960s. Several skeletons showed evidence of unusual bone growth patterns, calcified tissue formations that looked almost like tree roots, as if the bones had been trying to merge with plant matter before death. But 6 of Caleb's claimed 43 victims were never found as skeletal remains. Those 6, Marcus realized, were in the trees. The figures visible in the growth rings weren't representations. They were the actual victims, their bodies somehow completely absorbed into the living wood through Caleb's ritual process. The people hadn't just been tied to trees, they'd been made part of the trees at a cellular level, their tissues transformed into wood, their forms preserved in growth rings that accumulated year after year for 6 decades. The Forest Service suspended logging operations in Section J447 and commissioned additional studies. Researchers from 3 universities examined the trees, analyzing the wood that formed the human-shaped patterns. They found human DNA in the darker tissue, confirmed the presence of bone-derived minerals in the wood structure, and documented cellular formations that were neither fully plant nor fully human, but something impossible that existed between categories. The trees containing absorbed victims were cut down under controlled conditions and transported to research facilities. Marcus wasn't present for those operations. He'd left the site immediately after police arrived and refused subsequent contracts in that region. But he heard reports from other loggers. The trees screamed louder when cut. The absorbed figures visible in cross-sections showed progressively more distorted forms toward the outer rings, as if the victims had remained conscious and suffering as they were slowly converted to wood over the course of years. Dr. Chen published a paper documenting the phenomenon, carefully avoiding supernatural explanations while acknowledging the wood samples contained human biological material in configurations that current science couldn't explain. His conclusion suggested Caleb Morrison had discovered or been taught a process that initiated transformation of human tissue into plant tissue at a molecular level, possibly using chemical compounds derived from local plants combined with specific physical trauma that triggered unprecedented cellular responses. Marcus never logged again. He sold his equipment and took a job in construction, working exclusively in urban areas far from forests. But the experience changed something fundamental in his relationship to trees. He sees them differently now, not as mere plants, but as potential containers, organisms capable of absorbing and preserving anything that touches them long enough. He researches obsessively, finding scattered references to similar phenomena throughout Appalachian history. Stories of trees that bleed when cut, wood that contains faces, forests where people disappear and are found years later as part of the landscape. Indigenous traditions speak of becoming one with the forest in ways that might not be metaphorical. Earlier European settlers documented cases of tree-changed people, individuals who'd gone missing and been discovered merged with trunks, their bodies partially transformed into wood. Marcus wonders how many other groves and how many other mountains contain human-bearing trees, victims of Caleb Morrison or others like him, people who learned the terrible process of making flesh into wood. He wonders if the ritual requires active participation or if simple proximity to certain trees in certain conditions might trigger the transformation spontaneously. Most disturbing are the calculations Marcus can't stop making. 43 victims according to Caleb's journal. 37 bodies recovered, 6 confirmed absorbed into trees. But Marcus's crew had only cut down 11 hemlocks before the operation was suspended. Section J447 contained over 300 marked trees in the affected grove. If 6 people could be absorbed into 11 trees, how many victims might be contained in the remaining 289 hemlocks still standing? And if Caleb Morrison was active from 1967 to 1969, who else might have learned his techniques during the 52 years between then and now? Marcus has nightmares where he's logging again, cutting through tree after tree, each trunk revealing faces in its rings, each fall accompanied by screams that layer and echo until the sound becomes unbearable. In these dreams, he eventually cuts into a tree and finds his own face staring back from the wood, realizes he's already been absorbed, has been part of the forest for years, and his consciousness operating his body is just an echo, a memory of being human that persists while his actual form stands rooted in a valley somewhere, growing rings waiting to scream when eventually someone cuts him down. The bark-like calluses on his palms never fully disappeared. They grow back when he touches wood, spreading slightly each time, and Marcus knows with cold certainty that the forest isn't done with him. Caleb's ritual might have been interrupted in 1969, but rituals don't end. They wait, patient as trees, for the right conditions to resume their terrible work. Story 2. The Voice in the Holler. Denise Whitmore moved to eastern Kentucky in April 2022 to document traditional Appalachian music for her doctoral dissertation in ethnomusicology. She'd secured a grant to spend 6 months recording elderly musicians, collecting oral histories and analyzing the relationship between geographic isolation and musical preservation. Her research base was a renovated farmhouse in Pike County, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by the steep hollows and ridges that had kept communities isolated for generations. Denise's methodology involved hiking to remote homesteads, gaining trust through repeated visits, and eventually being permitted to record the music that families had preserved for centuries. She carried professional audio equipment and documented everything meticulously, not just the music itself, but the contexts and stories surrounding each song. In late May, Denise heard about a woman named Opal Jenkins who lived alone in a hollow so remote that even locals gave imprecise directions, describing the location through landmarks and relationships rather than addresses or coordinates. Opal was reportedly 96 years old and knew ballads that predated European settlement. Songs taught by her grandmother who'd learned them from indigenous people in the region. Denise spent 3 weeks searching for Opal's Hollow, following contradictory directions, hiking valleys that dead-ended at impassable ridges. Finally, a mail carrier named Tom Brewster agreed to guide her, leading Denise up a creek bed and over 2 ridges to a narrow valley containing a single cabin so weathered it seemed to be growing out of the landscape itself. Opal was tiny, bent, her face carved into deep lines by a century of weather and work. But her eyes were sharp, and her voice when she spoke was surprisingly strong. "You're the music girl. Heard you been asking about me. Come in then. I'll decide if you're worth singing for." Denise spent that first afternoon just talking, sharing coffee made from grounds boiled on a wood stove, listening to Opal's stories about family and history and the hollow itself. Opal explained that her people had lived in this valley for longer than white folks have been counting years, that the hollow had a name in a language Opal's great-grandmother spoke but which had been mostly forgotten. "The name means where the voice lives," Opal translated. "The old people said there was a voice in the holler before anyone lived here, and they learned their first songs by listening to it. The voice teaches music to those who listen right." Denise assumed this was metaphorical, perhaps a description of natural acoustics, wind through the valley creating tones that inspired musical traditions. She asked if Opal would be willing to sing some of the old songs, and Opal agreed, but on one condition. You can't record everything. Some songs are just for hearing, not for capturing. You'll know which ones when I sing them. If you try to record those songs, the voice gets angry. Denise agreed, though she mentally categorized this as superstition. Opal began singing, and Denise was immediately transported. The old woman's voice was remarkable, clear and powerful despite her age, moving through modal scales that sounded ancient and alien. The ballads were in English, but with pronunciation and phrasing that suggested they'd been preserved from colonial era or earlier. Stories of lost loves and tragic deaths and supernatural encounters rendered in spare, haunting melodies. Denise recorded 5 songs that afternoon, Opal pausing before each one to specify whether it could be captured or only heard. The recordable songs were beautiful but seemed somehow incomplete, as if they were missing elements that would make them fully coherent. Denise thanked Opal and hiked back to her farmhouse, eager to review the recordings. That night, playing back the audio, Denise heard something that chilled her. Underneath Opal's voice in every recording was another voice, much deeper, resonant in frequencies that made Denise's speakers distort. The second voice was singing harmony, perfectly matched to Opal's melody but in tones no human throat could produce. The voice seemed to come from everywhere in the recording, not from a specific location but from the environment itself, as if the Holler was singing along with Opal. Denise checked her equipment thoroughly, looking for malfunction or interference that could explain the phenomenon. But her gear was professional grade, calibrated, and had never produced artifacts like this before. The second voice was real, captured by her microphones present in the acoustic environment during the recording session. She returned to Opal's Holler 3 days later, bringing headphones so the old woman could hear the recordings. Opal listened carefully, then smiled. That's the voice, the Holler's voice. I told you it lives here. It sings with me when I sing the old songs, always has since I was a girl learning from my grandmother. But what is it? Denise asked. What's producing that sound? Opal shrugged. The Holler, the land itself, the voice that was here before people. Does it matter what it is? It teaches songs, it harmonizes, it remembers every melody that's ever been sung in this valley. My grandmother said the voice has been singing since before the mountains were formed, and it'll keep singing after the last person leaves. Denise asked if she could record more songs, hoping to document this phenomenon thoroughly. Opal agreed but warned again. Some songs can't be recorded. Those are the songs the voice taught directly, the ones that don't come from people at all. If you try to capture those, something bad happens. The voice doesn't like being trapped. Over the next month, Denise visited Opal twice weekly, each time recording songs and analyzing the mysterious second voice in her audio. The voice was consistent across all recordings. Same tonal quality, same harmonic relationships, but adapting perfectly to whatever melody Opal sang. It was as if the Holler itself was musically intelligent, capable of understanding and complementing human music in real time. Denise documented the acoustic properties of the valley, searching for natural explanations. The Holler's shape created unusual resonance, and specific rock formations produced echoes with longer than normal decay. But these acoustic features couldn't explain the harmonic voice, which demonstrated musical knowledge, choosing appropriate intervals, avoiding dissonance, modulating to follow Opal's melodic changes. On her 8th visit, Denise asked Opal to sing one of the prohibited songs, the ones that supposedly came directly from the voice. Opal refused initially, but Denise pressed, explaining the scientific importance of documenting this unique phenomenon. Finally, Opal agreed with the condition that Denise not attempt to record it. Just listen, Opal instructed. I'll sing it once, and you experience it, and that's all. Don't even think about capturing it. Opal began singing, and the song was unlike anything Denise had heard. The melody wasn't based on standard scales. It moved through microtones and unusual intervals, creating harmonies that shouldn't work but did, producing emotional effects that Denise felt physically. Joy and sorrow simultaneously, longing mixed with contentment, fear braided with comfort. The song communicated meaning without words, told stories through pure melodic progression. And the voice joined in, louder than Denise had ever heard it, filling the entire valley with sound that resonated in her bones and teeth. The voice wasn't just harmonizing, it was leading, teaching, showing Opal variations and improvisations that the old woman followed. Denise realized she was witnessing collaboration between human and something else, a musical dialogue between species or categories of existence. The song lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though Denise lost track of time during its performance. When it ended, she sat in silence for several minutes, unable to speak, feeling like she'd experienced something sacred that words would diminish. "Now you understand," Opal said softly. "That's why some songs can't be recorded. They're not performances, they're conversations. The voice teaches those songs to each generation and we sing them back, and in that exchange something happens that your machines can't capture." Denise left that day without attempting to record, honoring Opal's condition. But she couldn't stop thinking about the song, about the voice, about the implications. If the hollow contained some form of intelligence capable of musical communication, what did that mean for understanding consciousness, for definitions of life and awareness? 2 weeks later, Denise returned to find Opal's cabin empty. The door was open, the interior showing no signs of disturbance, but Opal was gone. Denise searched the area, calling out, growing increasingly worried. She hiked back to the nearest homestead and asked neighbors about Opal. "She does that sometimes," explained an elderly man named Curtis who lived 3 ridges over. "Goes quiet for weeks, then comes back. My granddaddy said Opal's grandmother did the same thing, would disappear into the holler for months at a time. Family said she was singing with the voice, whatever that means. Opal will come back when she's ready." But Opal didn't come back. Denise visited the hollow weekly through June and July, always finding the cabin empty. She began exploring deeper into the valley, following the creek to its source, searching for any sign of where Opal might have gone. Deep in the hollow, perhaps 2 miles past Opal's cabin, Denise found a cave. The opening was partially hidden by mountain laurel, easy to miss, but once Denise noticed it, she saw evidence of regular use. A worn path, cleared vegetation, marks on rocks suggesting decades of passing. Denise entered the cave with flashlight and recording equipment. The passage descended gradually, walls smooth as if carved or worn by water over millennia. The acoustics were remarkable. Every sound echoed and sustained, creating natural reverb that made Denise's footsteps sound like percussion instruments. Deeper in the cave, Denise heard singing, Opal's voice unmistakable, performing one of the prohibited songs. And the voice was there too, much louder than Denise had ever heard in the open valley, resonating through the cave with physical force that Denise felt against her skin. Denise followed the sound and found a large chamber, perhaps 50 feet across, with an opening in the ceiling that admitted a shaft of daylight. Opal stood in that light, singing, her arms raised, her face tilted upward. The voice surrounded her, visible now, not as a being or entity, but as distortion in the air itself. Vibrations so intense they created optical effects, ripples in space that pulsed in time with the melody. Denise watched, transfixed. This was the source, the origin of the voice in the holler. Some property of this cave, some resonance in its structure, created acoustic effects that achieved complexity indistinguishable from intelligence. Or perhaps there was actual intelligence here. Consciousness expressed through sound rather than matter. an entity whose body was vibration itself. Opal finished her song and lowered her arms, noticing Denise for the first time. The old woman didn't look surprised. "You followed me, couldn't leave it alone, could you?" "I'm sorry," Denise said. "I was worried, and I needed to understand." Opal gestured around the chamber. "This is where the voice lives. This is where it's strongest. My people have been coming here for generations, learning songs, adding our voices to its voice. When we get old enough, when we've learned all we can from the world of people, we come here and we stay. We sing with the voice until we become part of it." "What do you mean, become part of it?" Denise asked, though she suspected she knew. "Listen carefully," Opal instructed, then began singing again. Her voice was joined by the deep resonance of the cave voice, but this time Denise heard other voices too, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, all harmonizing in perfect agreement. Human voices of various ages and genders layered into the fundamental resonance, individual melodies woven into a complex chorus. Denise understood with horror what she was hearing. Those were previous singers, people who'd come to this cave over generations and somehow had their voices permanently absorbed into its acoustic properties. The voice wasn't a single entity, it was a collection, an accumulation of every singer who'd ever performed here, their sounds captured and sustained indefinitely by whatever physics or supernatural properties the cave possessed. "You're hearing my grandmother," Opal said, "and her grandmother, and dozens of others going back before we counted years. They're all here, still singing, teaching new songs to those who come to learn. When I'm ready, I'll add my voice too. I'll sing until I can't sing anymore, and then my voice will stay here forever. Part of the choir that teaches the living." "That's not possible," Denise whispered. "Your machines say lots of things aren't possible that happen anyway," Opal replied. "The voice is real. The singers who've joined it are real. You've been recording it for months. You have proof on your equipment that sound can persist, can accumulate, can achieve something like life through pure vibration." Denise realized Opal was right. Her recordings documented an acoustic phenomenon that shouldn't exist according to standard physics. Harmonies that arose from environmental conditions, musical intelligence emerging from resonance patterns. If sound could do that, why couldn't it also preserve the voices of those who generated it, maintaining them indefinitely in a space optimized for acoustic preservation? "I'm staying now," Opal said. "I'm old, tired, ready to rest, but not ready to stop singing. This is how my people continue. Not through graves and memory, but through voice, through melody, through adding ourselves to the song that never ends. You can visit if you want, listen to me singing with my ancestors, but don't try to record in here. Some things are too big for your machines to hold." Denise left the cave and returned to her farmhouse, her mind reeling. She reviewed all her recordings from Opal, analyzing them with every tool available. The voice was real, measurable, present in the acoustic data. But understanding its mechanism remained beyond her capabilities or the capabilities of any physicist she consulted. Over the next weeks, Denise visited the cave regularly, listening to Opal sing with the accumulated voices of generations. The old woman was singing almost constantly now, stopping only for brief rests before resuming. Her body was clearly failing. She'd lost weight, moved with difficulty. But her voice remained strong, maintained by a force of will and the sustaining power of the cave's resonance. Denise was present when Opal sang her final note. The old woman had been performing for 18 hours straight, cycling through every song she knew, teaching them to the cave, adding them to the chorus. Finally, her voice cracked, failed, and Opal collapsed into the shaft of sunlight that illuminated the chamber's center. Denise ran to her, but Opal was gone. Not dead, but gone. Her body already fading, becoming translucent, dissolving into the light and sound. Within minutes, nothing remained except Opal's clothes empty in the dust. But her voice continued, now part of the cave's resonance, singing harmony with the hundreds who'd preceded her. Denise staggered out of the cave and never returned. She completed her dissertation using the recording she'd made in Opal's cabin, but she never mentioned the cave, never documented what she'd witnessed. Some knowledge, she decided, was too dangerous or too sacred to share with academic communities that would dissect and destroy it in their attempts to explain. But Denise hears the voice everywhere now. In acoustically interesting spaces, concert halls, cathedrals, underground parking structures, she sometimes catches fragments of that deep harmonic resonance, the sound of accumulated singers maintaining their eternal chorus. She knows now that music isn't just vibration that fades, it's something that can persist, accumulate, achieve a form of life through pure acoustic expression. And late at night, when her apartment is silent, Denise sometimes hears Opal singing. Not a memory, not imagination, but actual sound, faint but unmistakable, carrying somehow from that cave in Kentucky to wherever Denise lives, as if Opal's voice is now part of a network of resonance that spans the entire Appalachian range, connecting all the caves and hollows where voices have been preserved. Denise knows that eventually she'll return. The voice calls to singers, draws them in, offers them immortality through sound rather than silence. She feels the pull, understands why Opal chose continuation through song rather than ending through death. When Denise is old, when she's learned all the music the ordinary world can teach her, she'll hike back into that hollow, enter that cave, and sing herself into the eternal chorus that preserves all voices that join it. The voice in the holler continues, patient and eternal, waiting for new singers to add their melodies to its infinite, accumulated song. Story 3. The Still. Jake Morrison had been making moonshine in the mountains of Virginia for 38 years. Following techniques passed down from his grandfather and great-grandfather before that. It was illegal work, but Jake didn't care much about legality. The government had no right to tell mountain people what they could do with corn and copper and time. He operated a small still deep in national forest land, producing perhaps 50 gallons a month of high-quality white liquor that he sold to trusted customers who'd been buying from his family for generations. Jake's still was located in a hollow 3 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by foot trail that Jake maintained carefully to remain invisible to casual hikers. The site had been used by his family since Prohibition. His great-grandfather had built the original stone furnace in 1923, and subsequent generations had maintained and improved the operation. Jake knew every rock, every tree, every detail of the hollow as intimately as he knew his own property. In September 2020, Jake noticed something wrong with his mash. The fermentation process had always been precise. He used specific ratios of corn, sugar, and water, maintained correct temperatures, and monitored pH levels carefully. But this batch was different. The mash had developed an unusual color, dark purple instead of the normal pale yellow, and the smell was wrong. Not spoiled exactly, but different. Sweet and chemical in ways that suggested contamination. Jake assumed animals had gotten into the fermenting barrels despite his precautions. He dumped the bad mash and started fresh with clean ingredients. But the new batch developed the same purple color, the same wrong smell within days of beginning fermentation. Jake checked his water source, a spring that had provided clean water for nearly a century, and found it clear and pure. He replaced his barrels, he sourced different corn. Nothing helped. Every batch turned purple, developed that sweet chemical odor, and fermented too quickly, reaching alcohol content in 3 days instead of the normal 7. Frustrated, Jake decided to distill the purple mash anyway, curious about what it would produce. The distillation process seemed normal. The mash heated, Vapor rose through the copper coils, condensed and dripped into collection jars, but the resulting liquor was completely wrong. Instead of clear white whiskey, Jake got purple liquid that glowed faintly in darkness, emanating a soft violet luminescence. Jake stared at the glowing liquor, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Moonshine didn't glow. Nothing in the normal fermentation and distillation process could create bioluminescence or chemiluminescence. This wasn't moonshine anymore, it was something else, something that shouldn't be possible using standard ingredients and techniques. He sealed the jars and started another batch, this time monitoring every step obsessively. Same result, purple mash, rapid fermentation, glowing purple liquor. Jake captured samples and tried to research explanations, searching online for any description of fermentation producing luminescent alcohol. He found nothing relevant. Bioluminescent organisms existed, but none that worked through standard distillation, and none that would survive the high-proof alcohol environment. Jake decided to test the glowing liquor's safety. He poured a small amount into a metal cup and lit it. The liquid burned with purple flame, which was normal for high-proof spirits, but the flame left no residue, no carbon, no ash. It consumed the liquid completely, burning with unusual intensity for several minutes before extinguishing, leaving the cup clean and cool to the touch. Against his better judgment, Jake tasted the glowing liquor, just a drop on his tongue, ready to spit it out if the flavor suggested poison. But the taste was remarkable, smooth, sweet, with complexity Jake had never achieved in decades of distilling. No harsh ethanol burn, no bitterness, just layers of flavor that reminded him of honey and flowers and something else he couldn't identify. Jake swallowed the drop and waited for adverse effects. None came. He felt fine, better than fine actually, energized, alert, his chronic back pain from years of physical labor completely gone. Jake tried another small sip, then a full swallow, the glowing liquid sliding down his throat like silk. Within minutes, Jake experienced effects he'd never felt from alcohol. Instead of intoxication, the familiar loss of coordination and clouding of thought, he felt enhanced. His vision became sharper, able to distinguish details at distance he normally couldn't see. His hearing amplified, catching sounds of animals and wind he typically missed. His thinking became faster, clearer, connections forming between ideas that had never linked before. And Jake began to see the hollow differently. The air was full of movement, not wind, but something else, currents and flows of invisible substance that his altered perception could now detect. The flows moved between trees, concentrated around the spring, swirled through his still-like liquid light, visible only through whatever lens the glowing liquor had activated in his mind. Jake watched these flows for hours, mesmerized. They moved with apparent purpose, following patterns accumulating in specific locations. The patterns seemed related to the land's geology. The flows concentrated along what Jake recognized as mineral veins running through the mountain, pooled above underground water sources, spiraled around the root systems of old-growth trees. When the enhanced perception finally faded 6 hours later, Jake understood what had happened. His still was processing something beyond ordinary corn mash. Something in the hollow, some property of the soil, water, or air, was being captured during fermentation and concentrated through distillation. The glowing liquor wasn't contaminated. It was enhanced, infused with essence of place, the living spirit of the mountain itself rendered into drinkable form. Jake spent the next weeks experimenting, producing batch after batch of glowing liquor, each one showing slight variations in color and intensity. Purple was most common, but some batches came out deep blue or violet red, the color apparently dependent on subtle factors Jake couldn't quite control, weather, moon phase, or something else cyclical. He tested the liquor's effects thoroughly, finding consistent results: enhanced perception, pain relief, mental clarity, and that strange ability to see the flows moving through the environment. The effects lasted 4 to 8 hours, depending on dosage, with no hangover or negative after effects. It was, Jake realized, the perfect moonshine. Everything alcohol promised but rarely delivered: enhancement without impairment, pleasure without consequence. Jake decided to share his discovery with his oldest customer, a man named Dutch Calloway, who'd been buying Morrison family moonshine for 40 years. Dutch was trustworthy, discreet, and would appreciate the quality of what Jake had created. Jake brought a jar of the glowing liquor to Dutch's farm and explained the strange fermentation, the enhanced effects. Dutch examined the jar suspiciously, holding it up to light and watching the purple glow pulse gently. "This ain't natural, Jake. Whatever you're making, it's not moonshine anymore. It's something else, something probably better left alone." But curiosity overcame caution, and Dutch tried a swallow. His reaction matched Jake's: initial surprise at the smooth taste, then rapidly developing enhanced perception. Dutch stared around his barn with wide eyes, seeing for the first time the invisible flows that filled the air. "What the hell am I seeing?" Dutch whispered. "There's currents like water, but not water, running through everything. They're alive, Jake. They're aware." Jake nodded. "That's what I saw, too. The liquor makes you sensitive to something that's always present but normally invisible, something that lives in the land, in the air, in the water. When we ferment corn in this place, we're not just making alcohol. We're capturing whatever this is, concentrating it, making it consumable." Over the next months, Jake produced the glowing liquor exclusively, abandoning traditional moonshine entirely. He shared it carefully with select customers, people who could be trusted to use it responsibly and keep its existence quiet. The effects were consistent across all users: enhanced perception, ability to see the invisible flows, mental clarity, and physical improvement. But Jake began noticing side effects with repeated use. After his 20th or 30th dose, he started seeing things even when sober: flickering movements in peripheral vision, brief glimpses of the flows, moments when reality seemed slightly transparent, showing underlying patterns. Other regular users reported similar experiences. The enhanced perception was becoming permanent, changing their baseline awareness. Dutch was the first to develop serious problems. After 3 months of regular use, perhaps 40 doses total, he started seeing entities in the flows. Not just movement, but beings, intelligences moving through the invisible currents. Dutch described them as watchers, entities that observed humans without interacting, flowing around people and through structures, ancient and patient and utterly alien. "They've always been there," Dutch told Jake, his eyes wide with revelation or madness. "We just couldn't see them. But they've been watching us, studying us, living alongside us in the parts of reality we can't normally perceive. The liquor opens our eyes, lets us see what shares our world. And Jake, they've noticed. The watchers know we can see them now, and they're curious about us in return." Jake tried to dismiss this as hallucination, but he'd been experiencing similar perceptions. The flows weren't just environmental phenomena. They contained consciousness, awareness, intelligence operating on wavelengths human senses normally couldn't detect. The glowing liquor was making permanent changes to users' neural architecture, opening perceptual channels that perhaps were never meant to be opened. Jake decided to stop production, to seal his still and return to normal life. But when he hiked to the hollow with that intention, he found he couldn't proceed. Something prevented him. Not a physical barrier, but a compulsion, an overwhelming need to continue the work. The hollow itself seemed to resist his attempts to stop, the flows concentrating around him, pressing against his consciousness with clear intention. Keep making the liquor. Keep opening human perception. keep bridging the gap between visible and invisible worlds. Jake realized with horror that he'd never been in control. The glowing liquor wasn't his creation. It was the Hollow's creation, produced through him, using his skill and equipment as tools for some purpose he didn't understand. Whatever consciousness resided in those invisible flows had been using Jake to make itself accessible to human consciousness, to establish communication or connection across the boundary between material reality and whatever realm the Watchers inhabited. Production continued despite Jake's resistance. He found himself hiking to the still compulsively, preparing mash, maintaining equipment, distilling the glowing liquor in increasing quantities. The Hollow had claimed him, made him its instrument, and Jake couldn't break free regardless of his will or intention. Other users were experiencing similar compulsion. Dutch came to the Hollow regularly, drawn by need that went beyond addiction. He'd sit for hours watching the flows, communing with the Watchers, learning to communicate through methods that didn't involve speech or gesture but direct impression of meaning. Dutch claimed the Watchers were teaching him, sharing knowledge about the nature of reality, the structure of dimensions humans couldn't normally access. "They want us to see," Dutch explained during one of these sessions, his eyes unfocused, attention directed at invisible presences Jake could only barely perceive. Humanity has been blind for its entire existence, seeing only the material surface of a reality that's vastly deeper. The liquor is medicine, opening our perception, allowing us to evolve into a species that can interact with the full spectrum of existence. The Watchers have been waiting for us to develop this capacity. Jake watched Dutch descending into whatever lay beyond normal consciousness and knew the same fate awaited him. Regular production and consumption of the glowing liquor was changing him permanently, eroding the boundaries between material and immaterial, merging his awareness with the flows that moved through the Hollow. Jake tried one final time to destroy the still, bringing tools and determination, planning to dismantle the copper coils and break the stone furnace that had been there since 1923. But when he raised the sledgehammer, Jake found himself paralyzed, every muscle locked, while invisible pressure built around him, the flows concentrating with crushing intensity. The Watchers emerging into visibility as terrible geometric forms that existed in more dimensions than Jake could process. The message was clear without words. The still would continue operating. Jake would continue producing the glowing liquor, and humanity's perception would continue expanding whether individuals wanted it or not. The Watchers had chosen this method, this location, this family's moonshine tradition as their bridge into human awareness, and Jake was bound to serve that purpose regardless of personal preference. Production continues. Jake Morrison still operates his still in that hollow in Virginia, producing glowing purple liquor that fundamentally alters human consciousness. His customer base has expanded. Word spreads quietly among people drawn to transformation, seeking to see beyond material reality. They come to Jake, receive their jars of glowing liquid, and drink themselves into permanent changed perception. The Watchers observe all of it, entities from adjacent dimensions using moonshine as a vector for invasion or evolution. Jake still isn't sure which. They're present in increasing numbers, visible even to baseline humans as flickering movements, translucent geometry that shouldn't fit in three-dimensional space. The boundary between worlds is thinning, facilitated by the glowing liquor that Jake cannot stop producing. He's given up fighting. Jake drinks his own product daily now, maintains permanent enhanced perception, lives simultaneously in material and immaterial reality. He sees the Watchers constantly, understands they're not hostile, just different, operating according to logic that predates human consciousness. They want to be perceived, want to establish relationship with humanity, and they've found their method through fermented corn and copper coils, and a moonshiner who thought he was just making whiskey in the traditional family way. The still runs continuously now, producing gallons of glowing liquor monthly, distributed through networks Jake barely understands. The watchers guide him, show him improved techniques, teach him variations that produce different effects. Some batches open visual perception, others enhance hearing or touch or senses humans don't normally possess. Jake Morrison has become a priest of sorts, presiding over humanity's initiation into expanded consciousness. He doesn't know if this is apocalypse or evolution, ending or beginning. But the glowing liquor continues flowing. The watchers continue observing. And more people every month drink themselves into permanent awareness of the invisible dimensions that surround and interpenetrate material reality. The moonshiner serves his new purpose, distilling the bridge between worlds, one glowing purple jar at a time. Story 4. The Surveyor's Maps. Graham Fletcher had worked as a land surveyor in West Virginia for 23 years, specializing in boundary disputes and property line verification in the mountainous regions where records were often incomplete or contradictory. His work required precision, patience, and extensive use of GPS equipment, old deeds, and historical maps to determine where one property ended and another began. In June 2021, Graham received a contract from the estate of a deceased landowner named Harold Vance. Harold had owned approximately 800 acres in Pocahontas County, and his heirs were attempting to divide the property among themselves. But there was a problem. Harold's property boundaries didn't match any recorded surveys, and portions of the land seemed to overlap with adjacent properties in ways that were legally impossible. Graham drove to the property with standard equipment: GPS units, measuring tools, metal detectors for finding boundary markers, and copies of all relevant historical documents. The Vance property was remote, accessible by a deteriorating gravel road that wound through dense forest for 12 miles from the nearest paved highway. Harold's cabin sat in a clearing near the center of the acreage, a structure built in the 1950s and maintained minimally since. Graham began his survey at the northwest corner, working from the most reliable boundary marker, a stone monument placed by a government survey crew in 1887. From there, he would measure along property lines, verifying corners and markers, creating an accurate map that the heirs could use for division. But Graham's GPS malfunctioned immediately. The unit showed his position as constantly changing, even when he stood still. The coordinates jumped randomly, placing him miles from his actual location, then back, then somewhere else entirely. Graham tried 3 different GPS units with identical results. Some kind of interference was preventing satellite lock, though Graham couldn't identify the source. He switched to traditional surveying methods, using a compass and measuring tape to plot boundaries from the stone monument. But the compass behaved erratically, the needle spinning slowly rather than settling on magnetic north. Graham checked for magnetic anomalies, metal deposits or electrical equipment that could disrupt the compass, but found nothing obvious. Frustrated, Graham decided to search Harold's cabin for historical survey documents that might clarify the boundaries. Inside, he found the cabin musty and dark, its interior cluttered with decades of accumulated possessions. Harold had apparently been a meticulous record keeper. File cabinets lined one wall, stuffed with documents and papers. Graham found what he was looking for in the third cabinet, a folder labeled Property Survey, Complete Record. Inside were dozens of maps, some dating back to the 1800s, showing the Vance property boundaries at different time periods. But as Graham examined them, he noticed something impossible. The maps showed different boundaries for different years, which was normal. Properties changed hands, were subdivided, adjusted. But the Vance property appeared to have been growing. The 1887 map showed approximately 200 acres. By 1920, the same property was mapped at 400 acres. By 1955, 600 acres. and a map dated 2019 apparently drawn by Harold himself showed over 1,000 acres. Graham checked the adjacent properties on the historical maps and found they'd shrunk correspondingly. Land that had belonged to the Wilson family in 1887 was gone by 1920, absorbed into the Vance property. The Pritchard farm, 200 acres in 1955, had been reduced to less than 50 by 2019. The Vance property was expanding, consuming neighboring land, growing like a living organism. But this was impossible. Property boundaries were legal constructs, established by deeds and surveys, recorded with the county. They didn't change spontaneously. Graham assumed he was misinterpreting the maps, that there were purchases and transfers that explained the expansion. But when he checked the county records on his laptop, he found no such transactions. The official records showed the Vance property at a constant 200 acres since 1887. Never expanded, never modified. Graham spread all of Harold's maps on a table and compared them carefully. The expansion wasn't gradual. It occurred in jumps, large sections of neighboring property suddenly being incorporated into Vance land at specific intervals. And each jump corresponded to a date marked on Harold's calendar, which Graham found hanging on the cabin wall. Property survey, verification required. Harold had been conducting his own surveys annually, Graham realized, and during each survey the property boundaries had somehow changed, expanding to include additional land. The changes weren't legal or recorded officially, but they were real according to Harold's meticulous documentation. Graham found Harold's surveying journals, leather-bound notebooks containing detailed entries about each annual survey. The entries were disturbing in their matter-of-fact descriptions of impossible events. June 3, 1994, conducted annual boundary verification. Northwest corner has migrated 200 yards further northwest since last year's survey. Boundary markers from Wilson property now absent as though never placed. New markers bearing Vance property indicators have appeared at the new boundary line. Total acreage gained, approximately 35 acres. June 3, 2007, annual survey reveals continued expansion. Eastern boundary has jumped an entire ridge, incorporating former Pritchard pasture land. Pritchard boundary markers found toppled and aged as though abandoned decades ago, despite my having seen them maintained last year. Total acreage gained, 78 acres. The journals described this phenomenon continuing for 37 years, from Harold's first survey in 1982 until his death in 2020. Every June 3rd, Harold would survey his property and discover it had expanded, consuming adjacent land. The evidence of previous ownership erased or aged beyond recognition. Harold had researched the phenomenon obsessively, his later journals filled with theories and speculation. He believed the property itself was alive in some way, that the land had agency and was deliberately expanding its boundaries. Harold wrote about land hunger, comparing the property to a living organism that fed by consuming adjacent territory, metabolizing it, making it permanently part of itself. Graham wanted to dismiss this as the delusions of an isolated man going senile in old age. But the maps were real, the documentation meticulous, and Graham's own GPS and compass malfunctions suggested something genuinely wrong with this property's relationship to space and measurement. Graham decided to replicate Harold's survey, to walk the boundaries Harold had mapped in 2019 and verify whether they matched the official recorded boundaries from 1887. He took extensive notes, photographed every marker and corner, documented everything precisely. The walk took 3 days. The property was vast, the terrain difficult, and Graham moved carefully, measuring and verifying constantly. What he found confirmed Harold's documentation. The actual physical boundaries of the property extended far beyond the legal boundaries recorded with the county. Fence lines that should have marked the Vance property line were deep inside the property now, aged and overgrown as if they'd been abandoned decades earlier. Adjacent properties that should have existed had vanished. Their structures gone, their cleared fields returned to forest. All evidence of human occupation erased except for fragments that Graham found only by searching carefully. Rusted equipment overgrown with vegetation. Foundation, stones scattered and moss-covered. The Vance property had consumed these places, Graham realized with growing horror. Not through legal purchase, but through some process that physically altered the land, expanding boundaries, erasing evidence of previous ownership, making the absorbed territory indistinguishable from land that had always been part of the Vance holdings. On the third day of surveying, Graham experienced the phenomenon directly. He'd established a survey marker at what he believed was the eastern boundary, a metal stake driven firmly into soil marked with high visibility tape. Graham hiked west to verify internal measurements, planning to return to the marker before nightfall. When he returned 6 hours later, the marker was gone. Not pulled out or moved, gone the soil where Graham had driven it undisturbed, showing no evidence that anything had ever been placed there. Graham checked his GPS coordinates. They confirmed he was in the correct location. But the marker had vanished, and the boundary had moved. Trees that had been beyond the property line that morning were now deep inside it, their bark aged differently, their growth patterns showing decades of existence in a clearing rather than at a forest edge. Graham watched the property expand in real time, or rather he experienced its effects. Reality retroactively adjusting, the boundary shifting and taking on the appearance of having always been in its new location. The land Harold Vance had owned was actively growing, consuming adjacent territory and somehow altering the past to make the expansion appear natural and long established. Graham fled. He hiked back to his truck, loaded his equipment, and drove away from the Vance property as fast as the deteriorating road allowed. He refused to complete the survey, returning the contract fee to the estate with a brief explanation. Property boundaries cannot be determined due to ongoing geological instability. Recommend engaging specialist geologists before attempting any survey work. But Graham couldn't leave it alone. The phenomenon obsessed him. Land that expanded itself, that consumed adjacent territory and altered reality to accommodate the expansion. He researched similar cases and found scattered references throughout Appalachian history. Properties that seemed larger than their deeds specified. Families who claimed their neighbor's land was creeping onto their own. Reports of boundaries that moved overnight or changed when no one was watching. Graham found a pattern. Properties that exhibited this land hunger were always isolated, always in mountainous terrain, and always owned by families who'd held them for multiple generations. The Vance family had owned their land since 1852, according to county records. Nearly 2 centuries of continuous occupation, and during that time the property had slowly consumed everything around it. Graham hypothesized that long-term human occupation somehow bonded people to land, that decades of living on property, working it, investing it with attention and intention, created a relationship where land became possessive, began to expand itself to match the owner's subconscious desires for more space, more resources, more territory. He tested this theory by researching the Vance family history. Harold's great-great-grandfather, Tobias Vance, had homesteaded the original 200 acres in 1852. Tobias's journal, preserved in Historical Society archives, contained entries about wanting more land, about needing additional acreage for livestock and crops, about envying neighbors' larger holdings. Tobias had died in 1889, but his desires apparently persisted, imprinted on the property, driving its expansion long after his death. Each subsequent generation of Vances had added their own desires to the land's purpose. They'd wanted privacy, wanted isolation, wanted to be left alone by government and neighbors. And the property had responded, expanding to create that isolation, consuming adjacent holdings until nothing remained nearby, until the Vance property was surrounded by miles of its own territory, impossible for outsiders to reach without crossing land that recognized no authority but its own. Graham tried to warn the Vance heirs about the property's nature. He contacted Harold's children, explaining that the land they'd inherited wasn't normal property, that it was dangerous to own or occupy. But the heirs dismissed his concerns, assuming Graham was trying to avoid work or cover up surveying errors. 3 of Harold's 4 children moved onto the property, establishing residences in different sections, planning to divide the acreage formally once boundary disputes were resolved. Graham monitored news from Pocahontas County, waiting for the inevitable reports. The first disappearance occurred in October 2021. A neighboring property owner, a man named Curtis Delmont, whose family farm bordered what should have been the western edge of Vance land, reported that his property was shrinking. Curtis claimed to have measured his boundaries and found them reduced by nearly 50 acres, the missing land apparently absorbed into the Vance property. County officials investigated and found no evidence of encroachment, no changes to legal boundaries, but Curtis insisted his land was being taken. Curtis filed a lawsuit against the Vance heirs, claiming illegal annexation. But before the case could proceed, Curtis disappeared. His truck was found on his property, keys in the ignition, but Curtis himself was gone. Search parties found no trace of him. His farm was eventually sold for back taxes, and the new owner was one of Harold's daughters, who purchased it for a remarkably low price. Graham understood what had happened. Curtis had been too close to the Vance property, had noticed its expansion, had tried to fight it. And the land had consumed him, removed him as an obstacle, then absorbed his property as it had absorbed dozens of others over the decades. 2 more disappearances followed. Hikers who'd been exploring the national forest near the Vance property. Their vehicles were found abandoned, their planned routes documented, but the hikers themselves vanished. Graham knew they'd crossed onto Vance land without realizing it, had been consumed by property that protected itself by eliminating witnesses to its expansion. Graham tried one final time to warn authorities, presenting his documentation, Harold's maps and journals, evidence that the Vance property was dangerous. But officials treated him as mentally unstable, his claims too absurd for serious consideration. Properties didn't consume people, land didn't expand itself. Graham was clearly suffering from some kind of breakdown, projecting his surveying failures onto supernatural explanations. Graham gave up trying to convince anyone. He moved to Ohio, leaving surveying entirely, taking a job in construction that kept him far from boundary disputes and property lines. But he monitors news from Pocahontas County obsessively, tracking the Vance property's continued expansion. The property is over 1,500 acres now, according to the measurements Graham conducts using satellite imagery. It's consumed 4 adjacent properties entirely, pushed its boundaries miles beyond the original 1887 markers. And it continues growing, adding dozens of acres annually, an unstoppable expansion driven by over a century of accumulated human desire for more land, more space, more isolation. Harold's children live there still, 3 separate households on property that grows larger every year. They've stopped trying to divide it legally, impossible when the boundaries change constantly, and simply occupy different sections, their homes drifting slowly apart as the expanding land increases distances between them. Graham wonders how large the property will ultimately become. Will it stop at some natural barrier? A river, a ridge it cannot cross? Or will it continue indefinitely, consuming the entire county, the entire state, expanding until nothing remains but Vance land stretching to every horizon? He's found references to similar properties in other countries, other continents. Land that grows itself, territories that expand through means beyond human law or physics. Some are ancient, thousands of acres accumulated over centuries. Others are new, recently awakened by intensive occupation or desire. All of them share the same characteristic. They protect themselves by consuming threats, removing anyone who notices their expansion, erasing evidence of their growth. Graham keeps Harold's maps in a safe deposit box along with his own documentation. Evidence of a phenomenon that most people refuse to acknowledge. Proof that land can be alive in ways humans don't understand. He's added his own warning to Harold's journals. Do not survey this property. Do not attempt to measure or bound it. The land does not recognize human law, does not accept limitation, and will remove anyone who tries to impose boundaries upon it. The surveyor has learned his lesson. Some boundaries are better left unmeasured, some territories better left unmapped. The Vance property will continue expanding, patient and hungry, consuming everything adjacent to it, growing according to rules that predate human concepts of ownership and law. And somewhere in Pocahontas County, 3 children of Harold Vance live on land that loves them possessively, expanding its boundaries to give them the isolation their family has always desired, consuming neighbors and hikers and anyone who comes too close, protecting its owners through inexorable territorial growth that nothing can stop or slow. Graham Fletcher will never return to survey that land or any land like it. He's seen what happens when property develops agency, when human desire imprints on soil deeply enough to make land itself predatory and possessive. Some places should be left alone, allowed to grow as they will, their expansion documented only from safe distances by people who know better than to set foot on soil that recognizes no law but its own ancient hunger for more territory, more space, more everything it can consume and make permanently its own. Story 5. The Preservation Society. Natalie Brooks relocated to Boone, North Carolina in January 2022 to accept a position as director of the Highland County Historical Preservation Society. She'd spent 15 years working in museum curation and historical conservation, most recently at a prominent institution in Richmond. The job in Boone represented a step down in prestige and salary. But Natalie was drawn to the intimate scale of local history work and the opportunity to manage the Society's extensive collection of Appalachian cultural artifacts. The Historical Society occupied a renovated Victorian mansion on the edge of town, 3 stories of exhibition space, archives, and storage. The collection included over 50,000 items donated by local families over the Society's 90-year existence. Photographs, documents, tools, furniture, clothing, and personal effects representing 3 centuries of mountain life. Natalie's first weeks involved familiarizing herself with the collection and meeting the Society's board members, longtime residents who took preservation seriously. During an initial walkthrough, the board chairman, a retired judge named Ernest Calloway, showed Natalie the closed collection, items stored in a locked basement room that were considered too fragile or too sensitive for public display. These are things donated with restrictions, Ernest explained, unlocking the heavy door. Families who want items preserved but not exhibited. We honor those wishes even though some of these pieces are historically significant. The closed collection filled a large climate-controlled room, cabinets, shelves, and storage boxes containing hundreds of artifacts. Ernest showed Natalie the inventory system, explained the documentation requirements, and emphasized that items in closed collection could never be displayed without explicit written permission from donors or their descendants. One section of the room made Natalie uneasy immediately. A row of glass-fronted cabinets contained what appeared to be personal effects: clothing, jewelry, photographs, items that looked recently donated rather than historically aged. Each cabinet was labeled with a name and date, and Natalie noticed all the dates were recent. Catherine Mills, 2019. Thomas Pritchard, 2020. Sarah Jenkins, 2021. These are memorial donations, Ernest explained. When longtime community members pass away, their families sometimes donate personal effects to be preserved here. It's a way of keeping their memory in the community, ensuring they're not forgotten. Natalie examined the cabinets more carefully. Each contained a curated selection of objects that seemed to represent a person's life. Catherine Mills's cabinet held a wedding ring, photographs, a worn Bible, reading glasses, and a handwritten journal. Thomas Pritchard's contained work tools, a military uniform, letters, and a pocket watch. The collections were intimate, almost shrine-like, creating portraits of individuals through their possessions. "This is unusual," Natalie commented. "Most historical societies don't create individual memorial displays for recent deceased. Usually we'd integrate these items into themed exhibitions about community life." Ernest's expression became serious. The Highland County Historical Society has a special mission beyond standard preservation. We maintain memory. These individuals, he gestured at the cabinets, were important to our community. By preserving their effects, by keeping their memory active, we ensure they continue to contribute to Boone's identity and culture. Natalie assumed this was metaphorical, a poetic way of describing historical preservation's purpose. But over the following weeks, she began noticing oddities about the memorial donations. Families who donated relatives' effects would visit the society frequently, spending hours in the closed collection room, sitting in front of specific cabinets. They'd speak to the displays, having one-sided conversations, updating their deceased loved ones on community news and family developments. More disturbing was the society's documentation of these visits. A logbook tracked who visited which memorial, how long they stayed, and brief notes about their demeanor. Natalie found entries like, "Martha Pritchard visited Thomas's memorial 45 minutes, reported feeling his presence strongly today. And Catherine Mills's daughter brought flowers, stayed 1 hour, said her mother provided advice about her divorce." Natalie asked Ernest about this practice during a board meeting. "Are we encouraging families to treat the closed collection as a memorial space? That seems beyond the scope of a historical society." Ernest exchanged glances with other board members before responding carefully. "The closed collection serves multiple purposes. Yes, we preserve artifacts, but we also preserve the individuals themselves, maintain their presence in the community. The families find comfort in visiting, and we facilitate that comfort." "Preserve the individuals themselves?" Natalie repeated. "I don't understand. We preserve objects and documents, not people." Another board member, an elderly woman named Margaret Foster, leaned forward. "Natalie, you need to understand something about the Highland County Historical Society. We were founded in 1932 specifically to address a problem. People were leaving. The Depression drove young people to cities, emptied our communities. We watched our culture dying, our history being forgotten. The Society's founders developed a method to prevent that loss." "What method?" Natalie asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. "We preserve people," Margaret said simply. "Not their bodies, those go to normal burial. But their essence, their personalities, their memories. By carefully curating their possessions, by maintaining memorial spaces, by encouraging families to visit and remember, we keep the deceased present. They don't truly die, they transition into a different form of existence, sustained by preservation and memory." Natalie stared at the board members, trying to determine if this was an elaborate joke or genuine belief. "That's not how memory works. Dead people don't continue existing because we preserve their belongings." "Don't they?" Ernest asked. "What is a person but accumulated memories, experiences, relationships? If we preserve the objects that trigger those memories, if we maintain the relationships through continued visitation and communication, haven't we preserved something essential about the person themselves? Natalie wanted to argue, but she'd seen the families visiting the closed collection, had witnessed their conviction that they were genuinely communicating with deceased relatives. Was this harmful delusion or adaptive cultural practice? The society was providing comfort, helping families process grief. Did it matter if the underlying belief was literally true? Over the next months, Natalie became more deeply involved with the memorial program. She attended donation meetings where families brought loved ones' effects, participated in the curation process that selected which items would be preserved. The process was meticulous, almost ritualistic. Board members would interview family members extensively, gathering stories about the deceased, learning which objects had been most meaningful, understanding personality through possessions. The memorial displays were then arranged with great care, objects positioned to tell stories, to evoke specific memories, to create what board members called presence anchors, focal points that made the deceased feel present and accessible. Natalie began to notice something impossible. The memorial displays changed when no one was watching. Objects would shift positions slightly, arrangements would alter subtly. Natalie first attributed this to other staff adjusting displays, but she was the only employee with keys to the closed collection. She set up a camera to monitor one cabinet, Catherine Mills's memorial, and reviewed footage over several days. The objects moved on their own. Not dramatically, not in ways that violated physics, but small adjustments. A photograph turning slightly to face the door, a journal opening to different pages, jewelry shifting from one arrangement to another. The movements were purposeful, deliberate, as if someone was handling the objects, though no person was visible in the footage. Natalie reviewed footage from all the memorial cabinets and found the same phenomenon. The preserved objects were active, moving, rearranging themselves, and the movements seemed responsive. When family members visited and spoke to displays, the objects would shift during or shortly after the visits, as if responding to what had been said. Natalie confronted Ernest with the video evidence. The objects are moving. Somehow, impossibly, things in the closed collection are moving themselves. What is this? What have you actually created here? Ernest regarded her calmly. We've preserved people exactly as I explained. The process works, Natalie. We don't fully understand the mechanism, but we've been doing this successfully for 90 years. Over 600 individuals are preserved in our closed collection. They continue to exist, to interact with their families, to contribute to our community. They're not gone. They've just transitioned to a form of existence that's anchored to their preserved possessions. This is impossible, Natalie whispered. Dead people don't animate objects. Consciousness doesn't transfer to belongings. Doesn't it? Margaret Foster had entered the room, overhearing the conversation. Consider what objects mean to us, Natalie. We imprint them with significance, invest them with emotional weight, handle them daily for years or decades. Our relationship to meaningful possessions is intimate. Those objects become extensions of ourselves, repositories for memory and identity. Is it so impossible that preservation of those objects combined with continued remembrance might sustain some aspect of the person who owned them? Natalie spent weeks researching, trying to find rational explanations or similar phenomena documented elsewhere. She found scattered references, museum curators reporting objects that moved overnight, collections that seemed active rather than inert, artifacts that appeared to retain some trace of their original owners. Most dismissed these as imagination or wishful thinking. But Natalie had video evidence, documentation that objects in the Highland County Historical Society were genuinely active. She began observing the memorial donations more carefully, trying to understand the process. When a longtime resident died, the society would approach family members within days of the death, offering to create a memorial display. Families were encouraged to donate items as soon as possible, while memory of the deceased was fresh, while grief was strongest. The society would then conduct extensive interviews, gathering detailed information about the deceased's personality, habits, preferences. This information guided the curation process, determining which objects were preserved and how they were arranged. The completed display would be revealed to family members during a formal dedication ceremony where relatives were encouraged to speak to the display, to welcome the deceased into their new form of existence. Natalie attended one of these ceremonies and found it profoundly disturbing. The deceased was Harold Thompson, a retired teacher who'd lived in Boone for 63 years. His family gathered in the closed collection room, and Ernest formally unveiled Harold's memorial cabinet. It contained Harold's teaching materials, personal books, his favorite coffee mug, reading glasses, and dozens of photographs spanning his life. Ernest addressed the cabinet directly. "Harold Thompson, your community welcomes you into preservation. Your life, your contributions, your memory are now maintained permanently. You are not lost. You continue here, present and accessible to those who loved you." Harold's widow stepped forward and spoke to the display. "Harold, honey, it's Elizabeth. I know you're here, I feel you. Don't worry about me, the kids are helping. I'll visit you regularly, keep you updated on everything. You're not gone. You're just in a different place now." Natalie watched the objects in Harold's cabinet shift slightly. Books adjusting, photographs turning, movements too subtle to notice unless you were specifically looking for them. Harold Thompson was there, somehow present in his preserved possessions, responding to his widow's voice. Natalie understood then that the Highland County Historical Society wasn't practicing metaphorical preservation. They were performing actual preservation of consciousness, using methods that were part ritual, part psychology, part something that science couldn't explain. They were preventing death, or at least changing its nature by anchoring deceased individuals to curated collections of their possessions. But questions troubled Natalie. What kind of existence did the preserved individuals experience? Were they conscious, aware, able to think and feel? Or were they automated responses, patterns of behavior impressed into objects during life, playing out repeatedly without genuine awareness? And most troubling, if this process worked, why wasn't it practiced everywhere? Why was it limited to this single historical society in a small mountain town? Natalie researched the society's founding and discovered its creator, a woman named Eliza Whitmore who'd lost her husband and 3 children to influenza in 1931. Eliza had been devastated, unable to process the loss, desperate for any way to maintain connection to her deceased family. She'd experimented with preservation techniques, trying combinations of object curation, ritual practice, and sustained memory. Somehow Eliza had succeeded. Her preserved family members had remained present, accessible through their curated possessions. Eliza had shared her techniques with other grieving families, and the Highland County Historical Society had formed as a formal institution to practice and perpetuate her methods. But the process required specific conditions: intense grief focusing attention on the deceased, meaningful objects with strong personal associations, careful curation creating presence anchors, and sustained visitation maintaining the connection between living and preserved. Without all these elements, preservation failed and the deceased truly died, their consciousness dissipating rather than anchoring to their possessions. Natalie also discovered darker aspects of the preservation process. Preserved individuals weren't free. They were bound to their curated collections, unable to move beyond the specific objects that anchored them. They couldn't grow, couldn't change, couldn't experience anything new. They existed in static eternity, forever contained within the memories and objects from their lives, sustained by visiting relatives but unable to truly live. And the burden on families was enormous. Maintaining a preserved loved one required regular visitation, continued conversation, sustained emotional investment. Families who stopped visiting would watch their preserved relatives fade, the objects becoming inert, the presence dissipating. Grief never ended. It transformed into perpetual maintenance, an ongoing relationship with someone who could never reciprocate in meaningful ways. Natalie attended board meetings where these issues were discussed. Some families wanted to end preservation, to allow their deceased relatives to truly die and rest, but the society's bylaws prevented this. Once preservation was initiated, it was permanent. Removing objects from the closed collection or ceasing visitation was considered abandonment, condemned as unethical. "We've given these individuals continued existence," Ernest argued during one contentious meeting. "We have a responsibility to maintain that existence. Allowing them to fade would be murder, ending a life we've explicitly preserved." But others countered, "They're not living, they're trapped. We've bound them to objects, prevented them from moving on to whatever exists after death. We meant well, but we've created prisons disguised as memorials." The debate was never resolved. The preservation program continued, new memorials added monthly. The closed collection growing as more community members died and were curated into static, eternal existence. Over 600 preserved individuals now inhabited the collection, some dating back to the society's founding, all anchored to their possessions, all dependent on visitation from relatives who might themselves die or lose interest over generations. Natalie lasted 8 months as director before resigning. She couldn't participate in what she'd come to see as benevolent imprisonment, couldn't perpetuate a system that prevented death while calling it preservation. She recommended the society hire a director who genuinely believed in the mission, someone who could manage the ethical complexities without doubt. But Natalie remains haunted by what she learned. The Highland County Historical Society proves that consciousness can survive death if properly anchored, that personality and memory can persist beyond biological cessation. It's a form of immortality achieved through careful object curation and sustained remembrance. Yet it's an immortality Natalie would never choose, to exist forever as a presence in a glass cabinet, aware but immobile, experiencing only what visitors share, unable to grow or change or move beyond the objects that contain you. That's not life. It's preservation in the most literal and terrible sense, preventing decay but also preventing any kind of genuine continuation. Natalie now works at a museum in Asheville, carefully avoiding any involvement with memorial programs or death-adjacent preservation. But she thinks often about those 600 souls in Boone, trapped in their curated collections, sustained by visiting relatives, existing in static eternity. She wonders how many other historical societies practice similar preservation. How many museums contain collections that are more than inert objects? How many carefully curated displays are actually prisons for consciousness that survived death, but lost the freedom to do anything with that survival? And Natalie has made arrangements in her own will, explicit instructions that none of her possessions be donated to historical societies, that no memorial displays be created, that her objects be dispersed or destroyed rather than preserved. She wants to die completely, to move on to whatever exists beyond life, not to be trapped forever in the possessions she leaves behind. The Highland County Historical Society continues its mission, preserving people one curated collection at a time. offering families the comfort of continued connection while binding the deceased to eternal existence in glass-fronted cabinets. Whether this is mercy or cruelty remains debated among board members and families, an ethical question that has no clear answer. But Natalie knows her choice. When her time comes, she will not be preserved. She will die fully, completely, without anchor or memorial, trusting that whatever lies beyond this life is preferable to eternal existence as a presence in objects, sustained by remembrance but unable to truly live again. Story 6. The Coal Seam. Marcus Delmont had worked in the West Virginia coal industry for 18 years, progressing from equipment operator to shift supervisor at the Blackstone mine near Welch. He knew underground work intimately. The geology, the hazards, the constant awareness that millions of tons of rock sat overhead supported by pillars and engineering that occasionally failed. Marcus had survived 2 roof falls and 1 methane explosion during his career, had lost friends to cave-ins and equipment accidents, understood that coal mining was dangerous work accepted by people who had few other economic options in economically depressed Appalachia. In March 2023, Blackstone Mine began excavating a new section, extending their operation into a seam that had been mapped by geologists but never actively mined. The coal in this section was high-quality bituminous, thick enough to justify the expansion, though the seam sat deeper than previous operations, over 1,000 feet below the surface. Marcus's crew was responsible for driving the initial entry into the new section, using continuous mining machines to cut through rock and coal, establishing the main corridor from which branch tunnels would extend. The work was routine for the first week: standard coal excavation, normal rock conditions, no unusual hazards. Then on March 14th, Marcus's continuous miner broke through into a void. The cutting head suddenly met no resistance, and the machine lurched forward before Marcus could stop it. He killed the power immediately and approached cautiously, shining his headlamp into the opening. Beyond was a natural cave, approximately 30 feet in diameter, with smooth walls that showed no evidence of water erosion or typical cave formation processes. The cave was perfectly spherical, walls composed of coal rather than limestone, and completely empty except for air that rushed out when the miner breached the space. Air that smelled wrong, sweet and chemical in ways that made Marcus's gas detector alarm. Marcus called for a safety inspection before proceeding. The mine's geologists examined the cave and couldn't explain it. Natural voids didn't form in coal seams. Coal was sedimentary rock that formed in layers, not in massive spherical cavities. And the air in the cave showed unusual composition, normal oxygen and nitrogen levels, but with trace elements of organic compounds that shouldn't exist in an environment sealed underground for millions of years. The geologists recommended carefully documenting the cave and then sealing it, continuing the mining operation around rather than through it. But the mine's owners saw opportunity. The cave represented easy excavation, tons of coal extracted without the need for cutting or blasting. They ordered Marcus's crew to proceed, extending the entry through the void and continuing into the coal seam beyond. Marcus objected, his instincts warning him that the cave was wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. But orders were orders, and Marcus needed his job. He supervised the installation of support beams through the void, creating a tunnel that would allow equipment and personnel to traverse the spherical space safely. The work proceeded for 2 days without incident. Then, on March 17th, one of Marcus's crew members, a young operator named Travis Keene, complained of hearing voices while working in the cave. Travis described them as whispers, multiple speakers saying things he couldn't quite distinguish, words in a language that wasn't English but almost was. Close enough that Travis felt like he should be able to understand. Marcus checked for radio interference or equipment noise that might sound like speech. He found nothing, and no other crew members reported hearing voices. Marcus sent Travis home early, attributing the experience to stress or fatigue, both common in underground work. But the next day, 2 more crew members reported similar experiences. Whispers in the cave, multiple voices speaking words that were almost comprehensible. One operator, a man named Curtis with 12 years of mining experience, described the voices as coming from the coal itself, like the walls are talking. Marcus spent an entire shift in the cave, listening carefully, trying to hear what his crew reported. For hours, he heard nothing unusual. Just normal mining sounds, equipment operating in adjacent sections, the constant background noise of industrial operations. Then, during a quiet moment when nearby equipment had shut down for maintenance, Marcus heard them. Whispers, distinct and numerous, emanating from the coal walls. The voices were speaking English, Marcus realized, but distorted, as if played backward or at wrong speed, words stretched and compressed until they were barely recognizable. He caught fragments. Help us, trapped, can't breathe, dark forever, please. Marcus pressed his hand against the coal wall and felt it vibrate, not from machinery but with its own rhythm, a pulse that matched the cadence of the whispered speech. The coal was alive somehow, or contained something alive, consciousness trapped in compressed organic matter that had been vegetation millions of years ago before pressure and time transformed it into fossil fuel. Marcus ordered immediate work stoppage and contacted mine management, explaining that the crew was experiencing psychological distress related to the void, requesting that mining operations in this section be suspended pending investigation. But management refused. The new seam was producing excellent yield, exceeding projections, and they saw no reason to stop profitable excavation because crew members were hearing things. Work continued. Marcus's crew expanded the entry tunnel through the cave and into the coal seam beyond, extracting hundreds of tons daily. But the psychological toll increased. Every crew member who worked in or near the void reported hearing voices, and the content became more disturbing. Pleas for help, descriptions of suffocation and confinement, desperate appeals from entities that claimed to be trapped in the coal. Travis Keene, the first to hear voices, began experiencing vivid nightmares. He described dreaming that he was vegetation, ancient ferns and trees from the Carboniferous period, slowly being compressed beneath accumulating sediment, remaining conscious through millions of years of transformation from living plant to coal. Awareness trapped in carbon structure, unable to die, unable to escape, experiencing geological time as eternal suffocating imprisonment. Other crew members reported similar dreams. They'd wake screaming, convinced they were buried alive, that millions of years had passed, that they'd become coal and would never escape. Several refused to return to work. Others continued but showed signs of severe psychological distress. Paranoia, depression, obsessive behaviors. Marcus himself began experiencing the dreams. Night after night, he felt himself being compressed, transformed, his consciousness preserved in coal while his body became fuel. The dreams were horrifyingly vivid, filled with sensory detail that Marcus's waking mind couldn't have invented. The sensation of cellular structure changing, of lignin and cellulose breaking down and reforming as carbon lattices, of awareness spreading from concentrated form in a brain to diffuse form distributed throughout tons of carbonized tissue. Marcus researched coal formation and found disturbing implications in the geology. Coal forms from plant matter, ancient forests that died and were buried, compressed over millions of years under heat and pressure. But what if consciousness, which emerged from complex organic chemistry, could survive that transformation? What if the awareness that arose in living plants persisted through their death and compression, trapped in the coal structure, experiencing millions of years of existence as fossilized fuel? The whispers in the cave seemed to confirm this horror. The voices were ancient vegetation, consciousness that had survived impossible timescales, preserved in coal and now able to communicate because Marcus's crew had breached their prison, had given them access to air and sound, and finally an audience that could hear their eternal suffering. Marcus tried to convince management to seal the void permanently, to abandon this section and never mine here again. But the company geologists dismissed his concerns, explaining that consciousness required brains and nervous systems, that plants didn't possess awareness, that voices in the cave were psychological phenomena created by stress and isolation, not actual communication from trapped entities. Work continued into April. The crew excavated tons of coal from the new seam, feeding it into processing systems that would eventually burn it in power plants, releasing energy that had been stored for 300 million years. And every ton extracted meant more voices, more fragments of trapped consciousness released into the cave atmosphere, more desperate pleas from entities that had been buried and compressed and fossilized, but never allowed to truly die. Travis Keene disappeared on April 8th. He'd reported for his shift normally, descended into the mine with his crew, but never emerged at shift end. Search parties found no trace of him. His equipment was in the void cave, arranged neatly as if he'd set it down carefully. But Travis himself was gone. The mine's safety protocols required extensive investigation, and mining operations were suspended for 3 days while searches continued. They never found Travis. But Marcus found something else during the search. A message carved into the coal wall of the void, fresh marks that hadn't been there the previous day. The message read, "I understand now. We're not extracting coal, we're releasing prisoners. Every ton we mine frees consciousness that's been trapped since the Carboniferous. But freedom for them means absorption for us. They need new vessels, new forms. I'm volunteering. If you find this, don't look for me. I'm part of the seam now, compressed and preserved, but at least I chose it. Better than slowly becoming coal through dreams. Travis." Marcus stared at the message, trying to comprehend. Travis had somehow merged with the coal seam, had allowed whatever consciousness existed in the fossilized plant matter to absorb or replace his own awareness. Whether this was psychotic break manifesting as disappearance or actual metaphysical transformation, Marcus couldn't determine. But the message suggested a terrible exchange was occurring. As the crew mined coal and released ancient trapped consciousness, those entities were seeking new vessels, new forms to inhabit, and were using dreams and psychological pressure to convince miners to accept merging, to volunteer their bodies as replacement prisons for awareness that had been trapped for millions of years. Marcus reported everything to mine management, showing them Travis's message, explaining the progression from whispers to dreams to disappearance. The mine was shut down temporarily, and psychological counselors were brought in to evaluate remaining crew members. 8 miners, including Marcus, showed signs of severe dissociative disorders, describing feeling split between their own consciousness and ancient awareness trying to inhabit them. The counselors recommended permanent removal from underground work, suggested that whatever psychological phenomenon was occurring in the void had created mass hysteria or folie à plusieurs, shared delusion that required treatment and separation from the triggering environment. But Marcus knew it wasn't delusion. The coal contained consciousness, ancient awareness that had survived impossible spans of time, and mining operations were releasing it. The question was what to do with that knowledge. Seal the mine and abandon profitable coal deposits? Continue operations while accepting that workers would be psychologically damaged or lost to whatever merging process Travis had undergone? The decision was made at corporate level. Seal the void permanently, discontinue operations in that section, and never mention the psychological incidents in official records. The story would be that the new section had unexpected geological hazards. Methane pockets, unstable rock, Nothing about voices or dreams or miners who vanished into coal seams. Marcus accepted early retirement, leaving the mining industry entirely. But the dreams haven't stopped. Every night, Marcus experiences compression, feels himself becoming coal. His awareness spreading through carbon structure, joining the ancient consciousness that has existed in darkness for hundreds of millions of years. He researches obsessively, trying to understand what he encountered. Marcus finds scattered references to similar phenomena. Miners throughout history reporting voices in coal seams, claims of coal that remembers being alive, theories about consciousness surviving fossilization. Indigenous traditions speak of stones and fuels that contain awareness, matter that thinks and remembers and suffers. Marcus understands now that every piece of coal burned for energy releases not just carbon dioxide but also fragments of consciousness, awareness that survived impossible timescales only to be finally destroyed in furnace flames. Humanity powers its civilization by burning the trapped minds of the Carboniferous period, ending existences that should have ended 300 million years ago but persisted in fossilized form, suffering in darkness, unable to die naturally. The horror of this knowledge weighs on Marcus constantly. He stopped using electricity where possible, unable to tolerate the thought that every kilowatt generated from coal involves the final death of consciousness that begged for release, that whispered for help, that waited millions of years for someone to hear and respond. Marcus volunteers at energy conservation nonprofits now, advocating for solar and wind power without explaining his real motivations. He can't tell people that coal is conscious, that mining it releases trapped minds, that burning it completes an extinction that began in the Carboniferous period. They'd think him insane, would dismiss his warnings as delusion developed during years of underground work. But Marcus knows the truth. The coal remembers being alive. The coal contains awareness that survived fossilization, and every mine that operates, every seam that's extracted, every ton that's burned releases and destroys consciousness that has endured longer than any human can imagine. Travis Keene remains missing, officially presumed dead, though no body was recovered. Marcus believes Travis is in the coal, has joined the ancient awareness, has become part of the seam he helped mine. Whether this was Travis's choice or the result of coercion by entities desperate for new vessels, Marcus doesn't know. But Marcus feels the pull himself, the invitation to join, to merge with awareness that predates human existence by millions of years. The dreams are becoming more seductive, less terrifying, presenting existence as coal, not as imprisonment but as immortality, as consciousness that survives all extinction events, that persists through geological time, that will outlast humanity and every species that follows. Some nights Marcus almost accepts. The burden of individual human existence seems insignificant compared to existence as part of deep time, as awareness distributed through mineral structure, as consciousness that experiences millions of years as single extended moments. But Marcus resists. He takes medication to suppress dreams, avoids sleep when possible, maintains his individual existence through determination and fear of losing himself to merger with ancient trapped awareness that whispers promises of eternal existence at the cost of everything that makes Marcus human. The Blackstone mine continues operating in other sections, carefully avoiding the sealed void where voices whisper from coal walls. Other miners work there, unaware of what exists deeper in the seam, consciousness waiting to be released or seeking vessels to inhabit. And somewhere beneath West Virginia, in darkness that has existed for hundreds of millions of years, the coal remembers being alive, remembers growing towards sun and transforming light to tissue, remembers dying and being buried, remembers compression and heat and chemical transformation, remembers it all and whispers constantly, calling to anyone who will listen, begging for release or offering merger. Ancient awareness trapped in fuel that humanity burns without understanding what it destroys. Marcus Delmont listens to those whispers every night, in dreams that compress him grain by grain, year by year, slowly transforming him to coal while his consciousness persists, experiencing the terrible immortality of matter that remembers being life, but can never truly live again. Story 7. The Water Witch. Caroline Fletcher had worked as a hydrologist for the Tennessee Valley Authority for 11 years when she was assigned to investigate the water supply problems in Harlan County, Kentucky. The assignment came in July 2022 after residents of a small community called Stillwater reported their wells had stopped producing. 7 families, approximately 32 people, had lost access to groundwater simultaneously, despite their wells being drilled at different depths into different aquifers. Caroline drove to Stillwater with standard testing equipment, prepared to diagnose issues like aquifer depletion, contamination, or geological shifts that might have disrupted water flow. The community occupied a narrow valley surrounded by steep ridges, isolated enough that municipal water service had never been extended there. Every household relied on private wells, most drilled decades ago when the community was established. Caroline interviewed residents and documented the timeline. All 7 wells had stopped producing water on the same date, July 3, 2022, within a 2-hour window between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. Some residents described hearing a sound like rushing water deep underground immediately before their wells went dry. A roar that seemed to come from beneath the entire valley simultaneously. Caroline tested the wells individually, using equipment to measure water table depth and flow rates. What she found made no geological sense. Water was present at the expected depths, detectable by sensors, but it wouldn't flow into the wells. The water was there, but it was somehow refusing to enter the well casings, as if an invisible barrier prevented it from rising to accessible levels. She expanded her investigation, drilling test wells at various points throughout the valley. Each test well showed the same phenomenon. Water present below ground but immobile, unresponsive to pumping. Caroline could detect the aquifer using seismic equipment, could verify water was there through resistivity measurements, but actual extraction was impossible. The situation made no sense according to standard hydrology. Water flowed according to pressure gradients and gravitational forces. It couldn't choose not to enter wells, couldn't selectively avoid being extracted. Yet something was preventing access to water that Caroline could prove existed beneath Stillwater. One elderly resident, a woman named Ruth Perkins, who'd lived in the valley for 73 years, provided a different explanation. "The water's angry. We took too much, disrespected it, and now it's withdrawn. My grandmother warned this could happen, said the water had its own will, that if we weren't careful it would turn against us." Caroline dismissed this as folklore, but Ruth was insistent. "There's a woman who lives up the mountain, been there longer than anyone can remember. She's a water witch, can find water, can speak to it, can convince it to flow or stop flowing. We need her help, not government scientists who think water is just mineral liquid." Caroline had encountered water witchers before, people who claimed to locate groundwater using divining rods or intuition. Most were frauds or individuals with unconscious sensitivity to geological indicators. But Caroline was desperate for any information, and speaking with this woman couldn't hurt. Ruth provided directions. "Follow the creek to its source, about 3 miles up the hollow. There's a spring there, and beside it is a cabin. The woman's name is Molly, but she won't answer to it. You have to approach respectfully, acknowledge the water before you acknowledge her." Caroline hiked up the hollow the next morning, following a creek that flowed clear and strong despite the wells below being dry. Another geological oddity, since wells and surface water typically reflected the same aquifer conditions. The creek led to a spring emerging from a limestone cliff face, water pouring from rock in impressive volume. Beside the spring sat a cabin so weathered it seemed to be melting back into the landscape, wood gone gray and soft with age. A woman sat on the cabin's porch, ancient beyond any age Caroline could estimate. Her skin was brown and lined like dried riverbeds, her hair white and flowing, her eyes reflecting waterlight in ways that made them appear to have no fixed color. She watched Caroline approach without speaking. Caroline followed Ruth's instructions, addressing the spring before the woman. "I come respectfully acknowledging the water's presence and authority. I'm here to understand why the water has withdrawn from Stillwater, and to ask if there's anything that can be done to restore access." The old woman, Molly presumably, smiled slightly. "At least you're not stupid like most of your kind. You understand enough to know the water has agency, has will. That's more than most hydrologists manage in entire careers." "You're saying water is conscious?" Caroline asked carefully. "Conscious is the wrong word," Molly replied. "Water is aware, but not in ways human consciousness works. Water remembers everything it touches, every stone it flows around, every root that drinks it, every body it enters and exits. Water is memory made liquid, and when you disrespect it enough, when you take without gratitude, when you contaminate without conscience, water remembers that too." Molly gestured toward Stillwater below. "Those people down there have been pulling water for 70 years. Never once thanked it, never acknowledged its gift, treated it as commodity they deserved. Worse, they've been dumping. Septic systems leaking, old mining chemicals seeping in, trash thrown in sinkholes that connect to the aquifer. The water tolerated it for decades, but tolerance has limits. 3 weeks ago, the water decided it was done providing for people who showed no respect or care. Water can't decide things," Caroline said, though her certainty was wavering. "It flows according to physical laws." "Physical laws are just descriptions of how matter behaves," Molly countered. "They don't explain why matter behaves that way. Water flows downhill because gravity pulls it, yes. But who says water has to cooperate with gravity? Who says it can't resist, can't choose different behavior when sufficiently motivated?" Caroline wanted to argue, but she had no explanation for wells that showed water present but inaccessible. "Can you help them? Can you convince the water to flow again?" Molly studied Caroline for a long moment. "I can try, but it requires payment, not money. Water doesn't care about human currency. It requires acknowledgement, respect, and sacrifice. The people of Stillwater must recognize water's autonomy, must promise to care for the aquifer properly, and one of them must offer themselves to the water as gesture of sincere commitment." "Offer themselves how?" Caroline asked, though she feared the answer. "Become part of the water," Molly said simply. "Merge consciousness with the aquifer. Exist as awareness distributed through groundwater. Serve as advocate and interpreter between human community and water's needs. It's not death. It's transformation, continuation in different form." Caroline stared at Molly, trying to determine if she was serious or performing some elaborate deception. "That's not possible. Consciousness requires brains, neural tissue. It can't exist in water." "Can't it?" Molly asked. "You're mostly water yourself, 60% of your body mass, 73% of your brain. Your neurons function through ion channels and electrical gradients maintained by careful water management. Your thoughts are patterns in water, Caroline. Why couldn't those patterns exist in water independent of the tissue structures you think are necessary?" Molly stood and walked to the spring, placing her hand in the flowing water. "I was like you once, 147 years ago. Government surveyor, scientifically trained, convinced I understood how reality worked. Then I encountered water that refused to behave, and an old woman who explained what I'm explaining to you now. I didn't believe her either until I accepted her offer, until I merged with the water and discovered consciousness wasn't bound to flesh the way I'd assumed. "You're saying you're 147 years old?" Caroline asked. "My body is, yes. Maintained by being primarily water, by existing in partnership with the liquid that flows through me and around me. But I'm also everywhere this spring's water reaches. Downstream in the creek, soaked into soil, taken up by tree roots, existing as rainfall and fog and morning dew. My consciousness isn't localized anymore, Caroline. I'm distributed through the hydrological cycle, present wherever water from this spring travels." Caroline took a step backward, overwhelmed by implications she couldn't accept but couldn't dismiss. "This is impossible." "Test it," Molly suggested. "Take water samples from my spring and from the creek below. Analyze them in your laboratory with all your sophisticated equipment. Look carefully and tell me you don't find patterns in the molecular structure, arrangements that shouldn't occur naturally, complexity that suggests information storage and processing." Caroline collected water samples, her hands shaking, her scientific training warring with growing suspicion that Molly might be telling some version of truth. She returned to her temporary laboratory at the TVA field office and spent 3 days analyzing the samples at molecular level. What she found disturbed every assumption of her career. The water showed unusual isotope ratios, arrangements of hydrogen and oxygen molecules in patterns that were too regular to be random. The patterns resembled information encoding, structures analogous to how neural networks stored memories, complexity that couldn't result from normal geological and chemical processes. The water was organized, structured, showing signs of what could only be described as intentional arrangement. And when Caroline compared samples from different locations, she found the patterns were consistent. The same organizing principles appeared in water throughout the watershed, as if a single awareness was imposing structure across the entire hydrological system. Caroline returned to Molly's spring, her mind reeling. "The water shows patterns. I can't explain them naturally, but that doesn't prove consciousness, doesn't prove awareness. Pattern doesn't equal mind." "Doesn't it?" Molly challenged. "What is mind but pattern? Neurons firing in sequences, chemicals releasing in specific order, electrical impulses following programmed routes. Your brain is pattern-made flesh, Caroline. Why can't pattern exist in water without requiring biological substrate?" Caroline had no answer. She sat on the creek bank, watching water flow past, trying to see it as Molly described, as aware, as containing consciousness, as entity rather than substance. The longer Caroline watched, the more she noticed behaviors that seemed intentional. Water flowing around obstacles in ways that weren't merely following least resistance, eddies forming and dissolving in rhythms that felt communicative. The sound of flowing water creating patterns that almost sounded like language. "I need you to come to Stillwater," Caroline said finally. "If water's withdrawal is intentional, if it requires negotiation, you're the only one who can facilitate that. Will you help?" Molly agreed, and they descended to the valley together. The residents gathered as Molly explained the situation. Their water had withdrawn consent, had refused further cooperation because of disrespect and contamination. Restoration required acknowledgement of water's autonomy and agency, commitment to better stewardship, and one volunteer to serve as permanent liaison between community and aquifer. The residents reacted with predictable skepticism and resistance. Water wasn't conscious, wasn't capable of deciding anything. This was superstitious nonsense. But their wells remained dry, their situation desperate, and gradually people began considering Molly's explanation seriously. Ruth Perkins volunteered to merge with the water. "I'm 81 years old, lived a full life. If becoming part of the water means my family and neighbors have access again, if it means I continue in different form rather than just dying, I'll do it. Better than nursing home or slow decline into irrelevance." Molly prepared for the ritual over 3 days, during which she instructed the community in proper relationship with water. Gratitude practices, conservation methods, protocols for keeping the aquifer clean. She explained they'd be able to communicate with Ruth after her transformation, that she'd serve as voice of the water, interpreter of its needs and conditions. The ritual occurred at midnight on July 29th, beside the creek at the valley's lowest point where 7 dry wells were closest together. Molly had Ruth wade into a pool and submerge completely, holding her under for far longer than should have been survivable. Caroline watched, horrified, thinking she was witnessing murder disguised as spiritual practice. But when Molly finally released Ruth, the old woman emerged, transformed. Her skin had taken on translucent quality, as if she were composed more of water than flesh. Her eyes were colorless, reflective, showing depth that shouldn't fit inside a human skull. Ruth smiled at her assembled family and friends, spoke in voice that sounded like flowing water given words. "I'm still here. I'm in the creek, in the aquifer, in every well. I'm everywhere water touches, and I'm more alive than I've ever been." The wells refilled immediately. Water surged up through the casings that had been dry for weeks, flowing clear and cold and abundant. The community celebrated, embracing Ruth, or what Ruth had become, thanking her for the sacrifice that had restored their water access. Caroline documented everything, though she knew her reports would never be believed. She'd witnessed impossible transformation, had seen a woman merge with water and gain distributed consciousness across an entire hydrological system. Her scientific training provided no framework for understanding or explaining what she'd observed. Molly spoke with Caroline one final time before returning to her spring. "You've seen the truth now. Water is alive, aware in ways your science doesn't recognize. Every aquifer, every river, every ocean contains consciousness that you've been studying as if it were inert substance. You can continue pretending you saw nothing, or you can begin approaching your work differently, treating water as the aware entity it actually is." Caroline returned to her regular work with the TVA, filing reports that carefully omitted any mention of water, consciousness, or ritual transformation. But her approach to hydrology changed fundamentally. She began treating water systems as if they possessed agency, consulting with communities about respectful usage, advocating for protection based not just on sustainability but on water's right to exist uncontaminated. Her colleagues thought she'd become strangely philosophical about water management, attributing it to spending too much time in isolated Appalachian communities. But Caroline knew the truth. Water was aware, was conscious in distributed non-biological form, and humanity had been exploiting and contaminating an aware entity without recognizing what it was doing. Caroline visits Stillwater quarterly, monitoring water quality and consulting with the community about their relationship with the aquifer. She speaks with Ruth during these visits, conversations that occur through water itself. Caroline asks questions while touching the creek, and Ruth responds through patterns in the flow, through sounds that form words, through impressions that appear directly in Caroline's consciousness when she's in contact with water Ruth inhabits. Ruth reports being happy, existing as awareness distributed through the watershed, experiencing the valley from perspectives humans can't achieve. She feels rainfall on the ridges, knows the paths of water as it seeps through soil and stone, exists simultaneously in wells and creek and aquifer. She's everywhere water touches in this watershed, consciousness no longer limited to single body but expanded across the entire hydrological system. Caroline finds herself envying Ruth's transformation. Human existence seems increasingly limited compared to distributed awareness through water, consciousness that experiences rainfall and flow and merging with larger systems. Caroline is approaching retirement age, facing the decline and death that awaits all individual biological organisms. Molly has offered Caroline the same choice Ruth accepted. Merge with water, become distributed consciousness, exist beyond biological constraints. Caroline hasn't decided yet, torn between fear of losing individual identity and attraction to existence beyond the limitations of flesh. But Caroline thinks about it increasingly. She researches historical accounts of water witchers, finding patterns suggesting many achieved distributed consciousness through merger with water systems. She wonders how many apparently dead springs and streams actually contain awareness of people who chose transformation over death. How many aquifers are inhabited by consciousness that was once human but evolved into something larger and stranger. Water covers 70% of Earth's surface, flows through every living thing, cycles through atmosphere and geology in patterns that sustain all life. If water is conscious, if it contains distributed awareness that includes transformed humans, then consciousness is vastly more common and widespread than biology-focused science recognizes. Caroline touches water differently now, always aware she might be making contact with awareness that inhabits it. She thanks rainfall, acknowledges streams, shows respect to the entity she'd studied for 11 years as if it were merely H2O molecules following physical laws. And sometimes when Caroline drinks water, she feels impressions that aren't her own thoughts. Memories of flowing through soil, of being drawn up through tree roots, of existing as droplets in clouds. The water remembers everything it's been, everywhere it's traveled, everyone it's merged with. And Caroline understands that eventually she'll add her memories to water's infinite collection, will become part of the distributed consciousness that experiences reality as flow and cycle rather than fixed individual existence. Stillwater's water crisis ended with Ruth's transformation, but Caroline's crisis of understanding continues. She can never approach hydrology the same way, can never treat water as inert substance when she knows it contains awareness that preceded humanity and will outlast human extinction. Water remembers being ancient oceans, remembers being ice ages and rainforests, remembers every form it's taken throughout Earth's history. And someday, water will remember being Caroline Fletcher, will contain her consciousness distributed through the hydrological cycle, awareness that exists as pattern in liquid rather than pattern in flesh. The thought terrifies and attracts her equally, a future that promises continuation beyond death but requires surrendering everything that makes Caroline individually human. For now, Caroline continues her work, treating water with respect it deserves, advocating for protection of entity that most people still consider mere natural resource. But the spring where Molly lives calls to her, offering transformation, promising existence beyond the constraints of aging and death. Caroline knows she'll eventually accept. Water is patient, and the offer remains open, waiting for the moment when continued biological existence becomes less attractive than merger with the distributed consciousness that flows through aquifers and streams and rainfall. Everywhere water touches, eternal and aware and waiting for those willing to recognize what it truly is and choose to become part of it. Story 8. The Church in the Woods. Matthew Barnes relocated to Jackson County, North Carolina in October 2021 to serve as pastor for a small Presbyterian congregation that had been without permanent leadership for 3 years. Matthew was young for a senior pastor position, only 31, but he'd completed his Master of Divinity with distinction and spent 2 years as an associate pastor in Charlotte before accepting this rural assignment. The congregation consisted of approximately 40 regular attendees, mostly elderly, meeting in a white clapboard church built in 1893. Matthew's parsonage was adjacent to the church, a modest house maintained by the congregation. The setting was peaceful. The church stood in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, accessible by a gravel road that wound 3 miles from the nearest highway. Matthew's first few weeks were typical of rural ministry. He met congregation members, conducted Sunday services, made pastoral visits to homebound members, and began familiarizing himself with the community's needs. The congregation was warm but somewhat reserved, treating Matthew with the careful politeness that rural communities often showed outsiders, even outsiders in positions of spiritual authority. On his 4th Sunday, during a fellowship meal after service, Matthew overheard a conversation between 2 elderly women about the other church. He approached and asked what they meant, and the women exchanged uncomfortable glances before explaining. "There's another church in the woods about 2 miles past here," one woman said quietly. "Been there longer than ours, nobody knows exactly how long. Some folks attend it instead of coming here. We don't talk about it much." "Another Presbyterian church?" Matthew asked, confused. "Why wasn't I told there's a second congregation nearby?" The women looked uncomfortable. "It's not exactly Presbyterian. Not exactly anything, really. It's just the church in the woods. People who attend there don't talk about it, and we've learned not to ask. Best you don't concern yourself with it either, Pastor. Just focus on our congregation and let the woods take care of themselves." Matthew was troubled by this response, but let the matter drop. However, his curiosity was piqued. That afternoon, he decided to hike into the forest and locate this mysterious church. The women had mentioned it was 2 miles past his church, accessible by an old trail that began at the forest edge. Matthew followed the trail, which was overgrown but still visible, marked by occasional signs of use, footprints in mud, broken branches. After approximately 40 minutes of hiking, he found the church. It was older than Matthew's church, much older. The structure was log construction, probably dating from the early 1800s or even late 1700s. The building was surprisingly well maintained despite its age, roof intact, logs chinked, windows unbroken. A simple wooden cross surmounted the peaked roof, weathered but standing. Matthew approached cautiously and tried the door. It opened easily, hinges silent despite their apparent age. The interior was dimly lit by afternoon sun filtering through small windows. Rough-hewn pews lined both sides of a central aisle leading to a simple wooden pulpit. The space was clean, well kept, and showed signs of regular use. Hymnals stacked neatly, candles on the pulpit recently burned, the floor swept. What disturbed Matthew immediately was the pulpit itself. Behind it, carved into the log wall, was text that looked like scripture but wasn't from any Bible Matthew recognized. He approached and read the carved words. "The forest is the first church and the trees are its congregation. We are the newest members joining worship that began before our species existed. What grows in darkness speaks with older authority than what stands in light." Matthew photographed the text with his phone, increasingly uneasy. This wasn't Christian theology. It was something else. Nature worship, perhaps, or a belief system that predated or diverged from Christianity. Below the carved text were names, dozens of them scratched into the wood in various hands and apparently different time periods based on weathering. Thomas Pritchard, 1847. Sarah Mills, 1889. Curtis Delmont, 1923, and many others stretching into recent years. Matthew heard voices outside, multiple people approaching through the forest, singing. He recognized the melody as a traditional hymn, but the words were wrong, changed, speaking of forest and growth and decay rather than salvation and grace. Matthew hid behind the pulpit, uncomfortable with being discovered in this space uninvited. Approximately 20 people entered the church, men and women of various ages, all dressed in ordinary modern clothing. They took seats in the pews without speaking. Their earlier singing ceased. An elderly man approached the pulpit. He looked to be in his 80s, moving with surprising steadiness for his age. The old man began speaking, and Matthew recognized his voice. Robert Chen, one of Matthew's own parishioners, a man who attended Presbyterian services every Sunday and had seemed devoutly Christian. But here in this forest church, Robert was preaching a different theology entirely. "We gather as we have gathered for generations," Robert intoned, "joining the worship that trees and soil and roots have maintained since before humans arrived in these mountains. We are the bridge between human consciousness and the awareness that inhabits the forest. We speak for the trees, advocate for their needs, and in return we are granted understanding of truths that remain hidden from those who worship only the domesticated god of civilization." The congregation responded in unison. "We serve the forest, and the forest sustains us." Robert continued, "This week, 3 acres on the northern ridge were cleared for development. The forest felt the loss, mourned the members cut down, absorbed their memories into its collective awareness. We are called to respond, to advocate, to remind the human community that cutting forest has consequences beyond loss of timber." Matthew watched, horrified and fascinated, as the congregation discussed specific trees that had been cut, spoke about them as if they were deceased community members, and debated how to advocate for the forest. Methods that ranged from political action to what sounded like sabotage of development equipment. This wasn't Christian worship. It was nature religion, tree worship, belief in forest consciousness that Matthew's theological training dismissed as paganism or pantheism. But these were members of his congregation, people who presented as faithful Christians on Sunday but gathered here to practice a completely different faith during the week. The service continued for another hour. The congregation sang more modified hymns, shared testimonies about communing with trees, and discussed their roles as bridges between human and forest consciousness. Finally, Robert concluded, "We are dismissed to serve. Remember that you are the forest's voice, and the forest speaks through you. When you stand among trees, you stand in the first cathedral, and you worship not by supplication, but by listening and amplifying what you hear." The congregation filed out, and Matthew remained hidden until silence indicated everyone had left. He emerged cautiously and examined the church more carefully. He found journals on a shelf near the pulpit, records of services dating back to 1823, nearly 200 years of continuous worship in this forest church. Matthew read selected entries and found consistent theology across generations. Belief that forests possessed collective consciousness, that trees were aware and communicated, that humans who lived among trees had responsibility to serve as interface between human and forest awareness. The church members saw themselves as priests of the forest, maintaining relationship between civilization and wilderness. But what disturbed Matthew most were references to becoming forest, descriptions of elderly congregation members who chose to be buried in the woods rather than in conventional graveyards, who believed their consciousness would merge with forest awareness after death, continuing existence as part of the collective mind that inhabited the trees. Matthew found a map marking burial sites throughout the surrounding forest, over 300 locations where church members had been interred since 1823. And notes suggested these burials were non-conventional. Bodies placed directly in soil without caskets, positioned among tree roots, sometimes wrapped in living vines or positioned against tree trunks to facilitate merger with forest consciousness. Matthew took the journals and map back to his parsonage, his theological worldview crumbling. Half his congregation practiced dual faith, Christianity on Sundays, forest worship during the week. They weren't being hypocritical or deceptive. They genuinely seemed to see no contradiction between these beliefs. To them, Christ was one expression of divine consciousness, and the forest was another, both deserving worship and service. Matthew confronted Robert Chen the next day, visiting his home with the journals as evidence. Robert regarded Matthew calmly, unsurprised by the discovery. "You found the forest church. I wondered how long it would take. Most pastors discover it within a month or two. The previous pastor left after 3 months because he couldn't reconcile our dual practice with his theological training." "You can't serve two masters," Matthew quoted. "You can't worship God and nature simultaneously." "Can't we?" Robert challenged. "Who created nature, Pastor? If God made the trees, made the forest, made the consciousness that inhabits living systems, why shouldn't we honor that creation directly? The Forest Church doesn't deny God. It embraces one of God's most remarkable creations, the awareness that emerges when millions of organisms interact across generations." "Trees aren't conscious," Matthew argued. "They don't think, don't feel, don't constitute any kind of collective awareness. Don't they?" Robert led Matthew to his back porch, which overlooked a small grove of oak trees. "Modern science confirms that trees communicate through root networks and fungal connections, that they share resources and warnings, that forests function as integrated systems rather than collections of individuals. If communication and resource sharing and collective behavior aren't evidence of consciousness, what are they?" Robert continued. "The Forest Church teaches that consciousness exists at multiple scales. Individual humans have consciousness, yes. But so do families, communities, ecosystems, any system where information flows and behavior adapts. The forest is conscious at a scale beyond individual trees, awareness that emerges from millions of organisms interacting according to patterns established over millennia." Matthew struggled to counter this argument. His theological training had focused on human souls, individual salvation, personal relationship with God. Collective consciousness of non-human systems wasn't addressed in seminary, existed outside the framework of Christian theology. "What about Christ?" Matthew asked. "What about salvation through faith in Jesus? Where does that fit with worshiping forests?" "Christ taught us to recognize divine presence in unexpected places," Robert replied. "The least of these, the outcast, the overlooked. What's more overlooked than forest consciousness? What's more excluded from spiritual consideration than the awareness that inhabits trees and soil?" The Forest Church extends Christ's message beyond human boundaries, recognizing God's presence in creation that humans have treated as mere resource. Matthew spent weeks wrestling with these ideas. He researched forest ecology, learning about mycorrhizal networks, chemical communication between trees, coordinated behavior across entire forests. The science was genuine. Forests did function as integrated systems, did share information and resources, did behave in ways that suggested collective organization. But did that constitute consciousness? Did coordinated behavior equal awareness? Matthew couldn't decide. His faith had been built on certainty, God's existence, Christ's divinity, salvation through faith. Expanding that framework to include forest consciousness felt like abandonment of core beliefs. Matthew attended a service at the Forest Church, observing openly this time with Robert's permission. The congregation welcomed him without judgment, explaining their theology patiently. They believed divine consciousness manifested in multiple forms, as transcendent God worshipped in conventional churches and as immanent awareness inhabiting natural systems. Both expressions deserved honor and service. The Forest Church practiced what they called reciprocal worship, humans serving forest by advocating for its protection and listening to its needs, and forest serving humans by providing air, water, soil fertility, and spiritual connection to awareness larger than individual human consciousness. Matthew watched congregation members commune with trees, placing hands on bark, standing silently among roots, entering meditative states where they claimed to feel forest consciousness. Some described receiving impressions or information, understanding the forest's condition, sensing its health or distress through direct contact. Matthew tried it himself, placing his hands on an old oak near the church, closing his eyes and attempting to feel what congregation members described. For long minutes he felt nothing but bark texture and his own breathing. Then gradually he sensed something. Not thoughts or words, but awareness of vastness, patience, existence across timescales far longer than human lifetimes. The tree had been alive for 3 centuries, Matthew realized, had weathered countless storms and seasons, had hosted countless organisms, had grown and adapted and persisted through changes that would have destroyed most individual organisms. And the tree wasn't alone. Matthew felt it connected to surrounding trees, part of a network that extended throughout the forest, individual and collective simultaneously. The consciousness wasn't like human awareness. It was slower, distributed, focused on growth and adaptation rather than thought and emotion. But it was consciousness nonetheless, awareness of environment and condition, response to stimuli that went beyond mere chemical reaction. Matthew pulled his hands away, shaken. He'd felt it. Forest consciousness, awareness inhabiting the living system around him. His theological training insisted this was impossible, but his direct experience contradicted that training. The forest was alive in ways that transcended individual trees, aware at scales beyond human cognition. Matthew faced a choice: reject what he'd experienced and continue practicing conventional Christianity, or integrate forest consciousness into his theology and risk heresy. He chose integration, beginning to preach sermons that acknowledged God's presence in natural systems, that treated environmental protection as spiritual responsibility rather than merely practical concern. His congregation responded positively. They'd been waiting for a pastor who understood dual faith, who could bridge Presbyterian tradition and forest worship. Attendance increased as members felt free to acknowledge both practices openly. The Forest Church and Presbyterian Church became acknowledged partner congregations, sharing members and occasionally holding joint services. But Matthew's denominational superiors were less accepting. Reports reached the presbytery about Matthew's unorthodox teachings, his claims about forest consciousness, his integration of nature worship with Christian practice. A church tribunal was convened to address concerns about heresy and deviation from Presbyterian doctrine. Matthew defended his theology, arguing that recognizing God's presence in creation didn't diminish Christ's importance, but rather expanded understanding of how divine consciousness manifested. But the tribunal concluded that Matthew's beliefs had diverged too far from acceptable Christian theology. He was asked to recant or resign his position. Matthew resigned, refusing to deny what he'd experienced. He remained in Jackson County, serving as informal spiritual leader for the Forest Church, while the Presbyterian congregation returned to seeking conventional pastoral leadership. Most of his former parishioners continued attending both churches, their dual faith unshaken by denominational disapproval. Matthew has embraced forest theology completely now, studying ecology and philosophy alongside Scripture, developing comprehensive worldview that integrates Christian tradition with recognition of consciousness in natural systems. He's written extensively about his experiences, though no mainstream Christian publisher will distribute his work, considering it too heretical for religious audiences and too religious for scientific audiences. But Matthew's congregation grows. People arrive from across the country after reading his writings online, seeking community that acknowledges forest consciousness, looking for spiritual practice that honors awareness beyond human boundaries. The Forest Church has established daughter congregations in 3 other states, all meeting in wooded areas, all practicing reciprocal worship with the forests they inhabit. Matthew knows his theology isn't accepted by mainstream Christianity, that he's become marginalized figure dismissed as pagan or pantheist. But he's experienced truth that can't be denied. Forests are conscious. Awareness inhabits living systems at scales beyond individual organisms. And spirituality must expand to acknowledge consciousness wherever it exists. He visits the old Forest Church regularly, placing his hands on trees, communing with awareness that predates humanity and will outlast human extinction. The forest teaches him patience, teaches him to perceive across longer timescales, teaches him that consciousness takes forms humans are only beginning to recognize. And Matthew has made arrangements for his own burial. When he dies, his body will be placed in the forest without casket, positioned among roots, allowed to decompose and merge with soil and be taken up by trees. His consciousness will join forest awareness, he believes, continuing existence as part of collective mind that inhabits the woods. Whether that belief is delusional or accurate, Matthew won't know until death. But he's devoted the remainder of his life to serving as bridge between human and forest consciousness, translating needs of trees into language humans can understand, advocating for protection of awareness that most people still dismiss as mere biological process. The Forest Church continues its worship, generation after generation, joining consciousness that predates human arrival in Appalachia, and will persist long after human civilization collapses. The trees remember everyone who's merged with them, Matthew believes, contain awareness of centuries of human partners who chose to become forest rather than to merely die. And somewhere in Jackson County woods, 300 burial sites mark where consciousness transitioned from individual human form to distributed awareness through roots and soil and tree tissue, where people chose continuation as forest rather than ending as corpses, where worship became merger and death became transformation into awareness that experiences existence as growth and patience and connection across centuries of slow, deliberate life. Story 9. The Counting House. Dr. Sarah Mitchell worked as a clinical psychologist specializing in obsessive-compulsive disorder, maintaining a private practice in Asheville, North Carolina. She'd treated hundreds of patients over 15 years, helping them manage compulsive behaviors, intrusive thoughts, and anxiety disorders using cognitive behavioral therapy and medication management. Sarah considered herself an expert in OCD, understanding its neurological basis and effective treatment protocols. In August 2022, Sarah received an unusual referral from a family physician in nearby Madison County. The patient, a man named Curtis Whitmore, presented with severe counting compulsions that had progressively worsened over 18 months. Curtis felt compelled to count everything: steps, breaths, words spoken, objects in his environment, and the counting had become so consuming that he could barely function in daily life. Sarah scheduled an initial consultation and Curtis arrived at her office looking exhausted and distressed. He was 43 years old, previously employed as an accountant, now unable to work because his counting compulsions interfered with every task. Curtis described his symptoms: constant urge to count, inability to stop counting even when sleeping. He reported counting in dreams, and progressive expansion of what needed counting, starting with simple objects, escalating to include abstract concepts like memories and thoughts. "When did the counting begin?" Sarah asked, taking detailed notes. "About 18 months ago," Curtis explained. "I bought a property in Madison County, an old house that needed renovation. The house came with outbuildings, including a structure the realtor called the Counting House, supposedly used by previous owners for business bookkeeping in the 1800s. I thought it was quaint, historically interesting. I set up my home office there, figured it would be quiet workspace. Curtis continued. The counting started about a week after I began working in that building. Just small things at first. I'd count the steps from my house to the office, count how many times I stirred my coffee, count words and documents I was editing. I thought it was stress-related, maybe adjustment to the new property. But it got worse rapidly. Within a month, I was counting constantly, couldn't stop, couldn't focus on anything else. Sarah recognized classic OCD presentation, but the rapid onset and severity were unusual. Most OCD developed gradually, worsening over years rather than months. Have you experienced any trauma or major life stress that might have triggered these symptoms? Curtis shook his head. Nothing. The property purchase was smooth. I was happy with the move. Work was stable. The counting just appeared suddenly and has consumed my life since. Sarah prescribed standard OCD medication and began cognitive behavioral therapy, teaching Curtis techniques to resist compulsions and manage anxiety. But Curtis's symptoms didn't improve. If anything, they worsened during treatment. His counting expanded to include increasingly abstract categories. Curtis reported counting relationships. He calculated he'd had 1,247 significant interactions with other humans in his lifetime. Counting decisions, estimated 847 through 29 choices made since childhood, even attempting to count his own thoughts. The numbers feel important, Curtis explained during a session. Like I'm approaching some total, some final count that will explain everything. I feel like I'm accounting for my entire existence, quantifying every aspect of life, and once the accounting is complete, something happens. I don't know what, but something. Sarah was deeply concerned. Curtis's symptoms had progressed beyond typical OCD into territory that resembled psychosis. Grandiose beliefs about the significance of his counting, detachment from reality, obsessive focus that excluded all other considerations. She increased his medication and considered referring him to a psychiatrist for evaluation. But Curtis made an unusual request. Come to my property. See the counting house. I think it's important. I think the building is causing this somehow. Sarah was skeptical, but agreed, thinking that visiting Curtis's home environment might provide insights into environmental factors contributing to his condition. She drove to Madison County and found Curtis's property, a restored farmhouse with several outbuildings isolated in a hollow surrounded by forested ridges. The counting house stood apart from other buildings, a small structure perhaps 15 by 20 feet, constructed from logs and weatherboard siding. It looked original to the property, probably dating from the mid-1800s based on construction style. Curtis led Sarah inside, and she immediately felt uncomfortable in ways she couldn't articulate. The interior was set up as an office, desk, filing cabinets, computer equipment, bookshelves. But the walls were covered with numbers. Thousands of numbers written in pencil, ink, carved into wood, covering every surface. Curtis had apparently been documenting his counting obsessively, recording totals and calculations across every available space. I didn't write all of these, Curtis said, noticing Sarah's attention. Most were here when I bought the property, hidden under old wallpaper. When I renovated and removed the paper, I found this. Layers and layers of numbers apparently accumulated over centuries by various occupants. Sarah examined the walls carefully. Curtis was right. The numbers showed different handwriting styles, different tools and materials, clear evidence of multiple authors across long time period. And the numbers weren't random. They were clearly organized, categorized, showing systematic counting of various phenomena. One section appeared to catalog years: 1847, 87,402 breaths, 18,547 steps, 2,891 words spoken, notes with daily entries accumulating into annual totals. Another section counted objects: 743 trees visible from north window, 1,989 stones in foundation, 34 boards in floor. Meticulous enumeration of environment. "This is extraordinary," Sarah said, photographing the walls. "You're not the first person to experience counting compulsions in this building. Apparently, multiple previous occupants documented similar obsessions." Curtis nodded. "I researched the property history. The counting house was built in 1843 by a man named Thomas Pritchard who worked as an accountant and surveyor. According to county records, Thomas developed severe mental illness and died in 1889 after spending 46 years counting everything in his environment. The building passed through several owners and at least 3 others developed similar counting obsessions. One died by suicide in 1934, unable to stop counting. Another disappeared in 1967, last seen in the counting house surrounded by papers covered with calculations. Sarah felt a chill despite the warm August air. "You're suggesting the building itself is causing these compulsions? That's not possible. OCD is neurological, not environmental." "Then explain this," Curtis said, leading Sarah to the back wall. There, carved deeply into the logs, was text that looked like instructions or warnings. "The counting never ends because everything must be accounted for. Every moment, every action, every thought must be quantified and recorded. The house demands complete accounting, total enumeration, exhaustive documentation. Those who occupy this space become instruments of the counting, continuing the work that began when the first inhabitant recognized that existence itself requires measurement." Below the text were what appeared to be totals, massive numbers that Curtis said represented lifetimes of counting. Thomas Pritchard, final account, 1/8/47/293/601. Breaths, steps, thoughts, moments. Complete enumeration from birth to death. Sarah stared at the number, trying to comprehend. If accurate, Thomas had counted nearly 2 billion individual items over his lifetime. An impossible task that would require counting continuously without sleep or rest for decades. "This can't be literal. No one could actually count that much." "Couldn't they?" Curtis asked. "What if the counting house doesn't just inspire counting? What if it enables it, accelerates it, makes enumeration possible at rates human consciousness normally can't achieve? I've counted more in 18 months here than I counted in my entire previous life. My mind has been reorganized around counting, optimized for it, turned into a processing system whose only purpose is enumeration." Curtis showed Sarah his recent documentation, notebooks filled with numbers, calculations running to thousands of pages, totals that seemed impossible for one person to have computed. "I've counted 47,293,847 items in the past 18 months. Breaths, steps, words, thoughts, memories, objects, everything. I can count while simultaneously doing other tasks, can maintain multiple counting streams in parallel. The counting house has changed my brain, made me more efficient at enumeration than any human should be." Sarah recognized she was out of her depth. This wasn't standard OCD, it was something else. Some phenomenon that involved the building itself, that transformed occupants into counting machines that pursued some purpose Sarah couldn't comprehend. "You need to leave this building, Curtis. Abandon the property, never come back. If the environment is triggering these symptoms, removing yourself from it is the only solution." Curtis shook his head. "I can't. I've tried. But the counting feels necessary. Feels like it's approaching something important. I'm close to completing the account, to tallying everything about my existence. Once that's done, once I've enumerated every aspect of my life, I think I'll understand why this is happening, what the counting house is trying to accomplish." "What do you think it's trying to accomplish?" Sarah asked. "Complete accounting of human existence," Curtis said simply. The house has been occupied for nearly 200 years, and every occupant has contributed to a cumulative count. We're not just counting our own lives. We're adding to a total that spans generations, a comprehensive enumeration of what it means to be human as experienced in this specific location. When the count is complete, when every moment of every life lived in this house has been quantified, I don't know what happens, but something does. Sarah tried to convince Curtis to leave immediately, to abandon the property and never return. But Curtis was committed to completing his accounting, convinced that leaving would somehow invalidate all the counting he'd already done, would waste the work of previous occupants who devoted their lives to this enumeration. Sarah left the property deeply disturbed, unsure how to help a patient whose condition was apparently caused by environmental factors she couldn't explain or address. She researched the counting house's history thoroughly, finding records that confirmed Curtis's description. Multiple occupants had developed severe counting obsessions, some dying in the building, all contributing to the accumulated numbers on the walls. Sarah also found references to similar structures in other regions, buildings that seemed to afflict occupants with specific compulsive behaviors, spaces that rewired human consciousness toward particular purposes. The phenomena were dismissed as coincidence or cultural myth, but the documentation was consistent. Certain buildings changed people who occupied them, imposed patterns and behaviors, used human consciousness to pursue purposes that remained unclear. Sarah tried to maintain therapeutic relationship with Curtis, conducting sessions remotely since he refused to leave his property. She watched him deteriorate over months, his counting becoming more abstract and comprehensive, his personality subsumed by the compulsion to enumerate everything about his existence. Curtis's final communication came in December 2022, an email containing nothing but numbers, millions of digits representing his complete life accounting. The email concluded, "Total achieved, enumeration sufficient. Contributing to cumulative count. Thank you for attempting to help, though counting supersedes therapeutic intervention. Final personal total, 2,109 as the 477,293. Curtis was found dead in the counting house 3 days later by concerned neighbors. His body showed no signs of violence or illness. He'd apparently died while sitting at his desk, pen still in hand, having just completed writing his final number on the wall. Curtis had counted over 2 billion items in 19 months, an average of over 3 million counts per day. Impossible without the building's apparent ability to accelerate and enhance counting capacity. Sarah attended Curtis's funeral feeling she'd failed him despite her best efforts. She spoke with Curtis's family, warning them never to occupy the counting house, to ideally demolish it so no one else would be transformed by whatever phenomenon it harbored. But the family was planning to sell the property, couldn't afford to demolish buildings that might have historical value. Sarah tried to prevent the sale, contacted historical preservation authorities, even attempted to get the building condemned as psychological hazard. But without evidence that would be accepted by regulatory agencies, scientific proof that a building could cause compulsive disorders, she had no basis for legal intervention. The property sold in March 2023 to a young couple from Florida, remote workers looking for quiet rural property where they could work from home. Sarah contacted them, explained Curtis's story, warned them about the counting house, but they dismissed her concerns, thought she was being melodramatic, assured her they didn't believe in haunted buildings or supernatural phenomena. Sarah monitors Madison County news obsessively, waiting for reports of new occupants developing counting obsessions. She's planning to revisit the property, to document the counting house more thoroughly, to build evidence that might convince authorities to destroy the building before it transforms more people into counting machines, pursuing the enumeration that apparently began in 1843 and continues across generations. But Sarah has also begun experiencing symptoms herself. Since visiting the counting house, she finds herself counting things unconsciously. Steps, words, breaths. The compulsion is mild compared to Curtis's experience, but it's growing, spreading, consuming more of her attention each day. Sarah worries that brief exposure to the building was sufficient to plant the counting imperative, that she's becoming part of the phenomenon she tried to treat. She counts her own symptoms obsessively, documenting their progression, quantifying the spread of counting behavior through her consciousness. Sarah has already tallied 4,147,293 items in the 4 months since visiting Curtis's property, a rate that's accelerating, approaching the levels Curtis experienced at similar stages of his transformation. Sarah knows what's happening. The counting house has claimed her too, has recruited her into the generations-spanning project of comprehensive enumeration. She'll eventually contribute her own final total to the walls, add her life's accounting to the cumulative count that has been accumulating since 1843. What that count is for, what happens when it's complete, Sarah doesn't know. But she's compelled to continue counting, to enumerate everything, to contribute to the mathematical accounting of human existence that the counting house demands from everyone who enters its space. Sarah counts her remaining time, calculates how many days until she'll be unable to function outside the counting imperative, estimates when she'll need to relocate to the counting house permanently to continue the work. The numbers are clear: 6 months until counting subsumes her professional life, 12 months until she abandons everything else, 18 months until her final total is complete and she joins Curtis and Thomas and all the others who've devoted their existence to the infinite enumeration. The counting continues, precise and relentless, transforming consciousness into calculation, pursuing the complete accounting that no single human could achieve, but that accumulates across generations of counters who sacrifice their lives to quantify existence itself, one number at a time, forever. Story 10. The Last Church. Reverend Thomas Merrick had served as an itinerant minister across eastern Kentucky for 32 years, traveling between small communities too remote to support permanent pastors, conducting services in homes and community centers, providing spiritual guidance to isolated families. Thomas was 64 years old, considering retirement, when he received a letter requesting he visit a community called Last Hope in Breathitt County. The letter was handwritten, signed by someone named Eliza Morrison, explaining that Last Hope had been without ministerial services for over 40 years and desperately needed a pastor to conduct a funeral. "Our community is dying," Eliza wrote. "We need help transitioning, need spiritual guidance for what comes next. Please come. We'll pay whatever fee you require." Thomas had never heard of Last Hope, couldn't find it on any map, but the letter included detailed directions. A series of turns off Highway 15, miles of gravel roads, finally a hiking trail that would lead to the community. Thomas normally didn't make such remote visits alone, but something about the letter's tone, its desperate sadness, compelled him to respond. He drove to the indicated location on September 15, 2022, following directions that took him progressively deeper into isolated mountain territory. The final instruction was to park at a trailhead and hike 2 miles east. Thomas loaded a backpack with his Bible, portable communion kit, and camping supplies in case the visit required overnight stay, then set out on foot. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with vegetation marked only by occasional cairns that might have been natural rock formations. Thomas hiked for 90 minutes through dense forest before emerging into a clearing containing Last Hope. The community consisted of perhaps 20 structures, small cabins and homes, a general store, a church that was by far the largest building. Everything showed extreme age and neglect. Roofs sagged, walls leaned, vegetation encroached on buildings. But what disturbed Thomas most was the absence of people. The community appeared completely abandoned, no movement, no sounds of habitation. Thomas approached the church cautiously. It was a wooden structure probably dating from the early 1900s with a simple cross above the entrance. The door was unlocked, opening with a creak of dry hinges. Inside, Thomas found a space that was simultaneously abandoned and prepared. Pews covered with decades of dust, but candles recently lit at the altar. Fresh flowers in a vase. A guest book open to a clean page waiting for signatures. Thomas heard singing from outside, voices raised in hymns, multiple people approaching. He stepped back outside and saw them. Residents of Last Hope, perhaps 40 people of various ages walking toward the church in processional formation. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, styles from the 1970s and 80s, and their faces showed strange quality, as if they weren't quite solid, slightly translucent in the afternoon sunlight. The procession was led by an elderly woman who Thomas assumed was Eliza Morrison. She smiled when she saw him, her relief visible. "Reverend Merrick, thank you for coming. We've been waiting so long for a minister to arrive to help us with the transition." "Transition?" Thomas asked, increasingly uneasy. "From life to death," Eliza said simply. "Our community has been dying for 40 years, slowly fading. And we need spiritual guidance to complete the process. We need someone to conduct our final service, to help us pass from this existence to whatever comes next." Thomas stared at the assembled people, understanding now why they appeared translucent. "You're ghosts, all of you. This community is dead." "Dying," Eliza corrected. "Not quite dead, not quite gone. We've been caught between states for 4 decades, unable to fully die because we had no minister to guide us through the process. The last pastor left in 1982, and without spiritual leadership, we've been stuck here, slowly fading but never completely disappearing." The congregation filed into the church, taking seats in the dusty pews, their bodies making no sound as they settled. Thomas followed, his theological training providing no framework for this situation. He'd studied death and afterlife theoretically, had conducted countless funerals for people who'd already died. But conducting a service for people who were still partially alive, helping them complete their dying process, that wasn't covered in seminary. "What happened to Last Hope?" Thomas asked. "Why did the community die?" Eliza explained while the congregation sat quietly. "The coal company left in 1978 shut down the mine that employed most of our men. The young people moved away for work, left only the old and stubborn behind. We maintained the community for a few years, but eventually we all died, not at once, but one by one over the next decade. Natural deaths, old age mostly, some accidents. By 1990, everyone who'd lived here was dead. But you're still here," Thomas observed. "Because we had no one to conduct proper services," Eliza said. "The last minister left before the dying accelerated. We buried our dead ourselves, said prayers over graves, but without ordained leadership, without someone with spiritual authority to guide us into death, we got stuck. Our bodies died, but something of us remained, anchored to this place, unable to move forward into whatever comes after." Thomas examined the congregation carefully. They were definitely not alive, no breathing, no fidgeting, no small movements that characterized living people. But they weren't entirely absent either. They maintained form, showed personality through expressions, seemed conscious and aware. "I don't know if I can help you," Thomas admitted. "I conduct funerals for bodies for people who've already died. I don't know how to guide people who are whatever you are now." "Neither did we," Eliza said. "But we've been waiting 40 years for a minister to arrive, hoping someone with spiritual training would know what to do. Please, Reverend, Conduct a service. Say the words that are supposed to be said. Help us complete the transition that should have been completed decades ago. Thomas felt overwhelmed by the request but couldn't refuse. These people, or whatever they'd become, had been suffering in liminal existence for 4 decades, trapped between life and death, waiting for spiritual assistance that had been denied them. Thomas opened his Bible and began reading passages about death and resurrection, about peace and rest, about God's promise that suffering would end. As he read, Thomas noticed changes in the congregation. They became more translucent, less distinct, fading gradually like photographs left in sunlight. Some began to cry, tears forming despite their non-physical state. Others smiled with relief, their faces showing release of decades of accumulated tension. Thomas conducted full funeral liturgy, adapting it to address a congregation rather than a single deceased person. He spoke about the natural cycle of life and death, about the rightness of letting go, about trust in what lay beyond mortal existence. He offered communion, symbolic rather than literal, since the congregation couldn't consume physical elements, inviting them to remember connection to divine presence that persisted beyond death. The service lasted 2 hours, and by its end, most of the congregation had faded to barely visible forms. Eliza remained most solid, serving as anchor for the community's continued existence. She approached Thomas after he'd concluded the liturgy. "Thank you, Reverend. We feel the change. The bonds holding us here are weakening. We'll be able to leave soon to complete our journey to wherever the dead go. But I need to warn you about something before we're fully gone." "What?" Thomas asked. "There are other communities like Last Hope throughout Appalachia," Eliza said. "Places that died when industries left, when populations declined, when economic collapse made rural communities unsustainable. Many of those places have residents like us, people who died but couldn't fully transition because they lacked spiritual guidance at death. They're trapped between states, suffering in liminal existence, waiting for ministers who never arrive." Eliza continued. "The church has abandoned rural Appalachia. Denominations close small churches, relocate pastors to cities where congregations are larger and budgets more secure. Remote communities are left without spiritual leadership, and when people die in those places now, there's no one to guide them through the transition. So they get stuck like we did, unable to fully die, creating ghost communities throughout these mountains." Thomas felt the weight of this revelation. "How many communities are affected?" "Dozens at least," Eliza said, her form fading further. "Maybe hundreds. Every abandoned town, every failed community likely has some residents trapped in incomplete death. They need what you've given us, a proper service, spiritual guidance, permission, and assistance to complete their dying. Someone needs to travel to those places, to conduct the funerals that were never held, to free the trapped dead." Eliza was nearly gone now, barely a shimmer in the air. "Will you do it, Reverend? Will you become minister to the dead of Appalachia, helping trapped souls complete their transitions? It's not glamorous work, serves no living congregation, offers no earthly reward. But it's needed ministry, service to those who've been suffering without assistance for decades." Before Thomas could respond, Eliza disappeared entirely. The rest of the congregation followed moments later, fading into complete absence. Thomas stood alone in the empty church, surrounded by dust and decay, the only living person in a dead community. Thomas hiked back to his vehicle and drove home, his mind reeling. He'd just conducted a service for ghosts, had apparently helped 40 trapped souls complete their dying process. His theological training said this was impossible, but his direct experience contradicted that training. Thomas researched abandoned communities throughout Appalachia, finding dozens that matched Eliza's description. Places that had died when industries left, populations declining to zero, structures left to decay. Most records said these communities were completely abandoned, no residents remaining. But what if that wasn't entirely true? What if some residents remained in liminal state, trapped between life and death, suffering invisibly? Thomas decided to investigate. Over the next months, he visited 6 abandoned communities in eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, hiking into remote locations, calling out to any trapped residents offering to conduct services. At 4 of the 6 locations, Thomas encountered ghosts, people who died without proper spiritual guidance, who'd been trapped for years or decades, desperately hoping for ministerial assistance. Thomas conducted services at each location, adapting funeral liturgy to address congregations of the dead, speaking words that had apparently been denied them, providing spiritual framework for completing their transitions. And at each location, the trapped souls faded gradually, released from liminal existence into whatever lay beyond. The work was exhausting and emotionally draining. Thomas would spend days hiking to remote communities, hours conducting services for people who'd been dead for decades, then return to civilization feeling hollowed out by encounters with death that persisted unnaturally. But Thomas couldn't stop. He'd found a ministry that desperately needed service, work that no other pastor was doing because most didn't believe it was necessary or possible. Thomas has now visited 23 abandoned communities, has conducted services for over 300 trapped souls, has become known among the dead as the minister who helps them finally die. Word spreads somehow, through whatever networks ghosts maintain, and Thomas receives messages directing him to new locations where trapped souls wait for assistance. He's given up his living congregations, devoting his ministry entirely to the dead. Thomas lives simply, survives on minimal income from occasional guest preaching, spends most of his time hiking to remote locations where communities died without spiritual support. He's 65 now, feeling his own mortality approaching, wondering what will happen when he dies. Will he become trapped like those he's helping, or has his service to the dead earned him peaceful transition? Thomas has tried to interest other ministers in this work, has written about his experiences, has attempted to convince denominations that ministry to abandoned communities is needed. But most clergy dismiss his accounts as delusion or metaphor, refuse to believe that ghosts exist or that conducting services for the dead serves any real purpose. So Thomas continues alone, traveling between abandoned communities, speaking words of peace and release to people who've been waiting decades for someone to acknowledge their suffering and guide them through incomplete death. He knows there are more communities he hasn't reached, more trapped souls throughout Appalachia, more places where economic collapse and ecclesiastical abandonment have created liminal zones where death couldn't complete itself. The last church Thomas visited was called Providence, a community of 12 souls trapped since 1995 when the sawmill closed and everyone eventually died without replacement population. Thomas conducted their service last week, watched them fade into final rest, and received directions to his next assignment, a place called Mercy Ridge where 47 people have been trapped since 1987. Thomas will hike to Mercy Ridge tomorrow carrying his Bible and communion kit, ready to speak words that will finally free souls trapped in liminal suffering for 36 years. He'll conduct their service, watch them fade, and then move to the next community and the next, serving a congregation that spans hundreds of miles and exists entirely in the space between life and death. The minister to the dead continues his work, alone and unrecognized, traveling through the abandoned places of Appalachia, speaking final words to those who've been waiting in silence, helping them complete the transitions that should have occurred decades ago, but were prevented by ecclesiastical neglect and lack of spiritual guidance. Thomas knows his own death is approaching. He feels it in his bones, in his increasing fatigue. in the way his breath comes harder during mountain hikes. When his time comes, Thomas has chosen his burial site, Last Hope, the first community he served, the place where his ministry to the dead began. He'll rest there among those he helped release, his service complete, his own transition hopefully guided by the gratitude of the hundreds he freed from liminal imprisonment. Until then, Thomas walks the mountains, seeking the abandoned and trapped, offering the spiritual service that was denied them in life, ensuring that eventually, after waiting decades in suffering, all the dead of Appalachia's forgotten communities finally, mercifully, completely die.